Hello there, everybody. This is David Bryce, and thank you again so much for joining me for part 2 of this incredible series that we're doing on the writings of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, the Jews in the Soviet Union. This will be part 2. You can search for part 1 on YouTube. It's about 2.5 hours long. We should get through the rest of the book review today from the Barnes Review. Just wanted to give you a little update of some information here that I compiled together. Really, this information is life-changing. The fact that it's been suppressed and concealed from the English-speaking world for 100 years is mind-boggling to me. And of great concern to me is that it seems that everything that led up to the Bolshevik Revolution and all the atrocity that occurred is actually happening again in the United States in terms of positions of influence being filled by people of Zionist persuasion within a Zionist agenda. So let's see if I can find what I wanted to share here. Okay. So interestingly, the Gnostics warned us about the evil God. They had a dualistic view of reality where they said that there's a good God and there's an evil God, and that this planet is essentially the battleground between those forces. And I mean, one way to describe it is that the evil God would be in the least likely place, which would be like in the churches, in the institutions of the state, you know, Rome, the black iron prison, as Philip K. Dick liked to refer to it as. And the true God would be found essentially in the trash heap, in the, you know, garbage in the alleyway, the small, the humble, unexpected places. And through these cracks, the light comes into the world. So it's interesting to consider that the Gnostics were trying to pass a warning down to humanity by saying that there's this false creator God that they referred to as the demiurge. They had a couple names for him. One was Yaldabaoth, which means, I'm not sure, but Samael means the blind one. And basically, they say that the demiurge covenanted with Abraham. And this is coming from Irenaeus, who's one of the early church fathers. Irenaeus, his book Against Heresies, book 1, chapter 30, section 10, he writes, Yaldabaoth himself chose a certain man named Abraham from among the nations and made a covenant with him to the effect that if his seed continued to serve him, the Archons would give to them the earth for their inheritance. Afterwards, by means of Moses, brought forth Abraham's descendants from Egypt and gave them the law and made them Jews, unquote. Even though the warning doesn't come down to us intact, in the pitiful remains of the Gnostic writings, it is an accurate and exact reflection of what the Gnostics feared and wished to pass along to humanity. The self-designated racial faction who made a pact with the Archons. Now, the Archons are essentially like fallen angels or demons. They serve the demiurge. If you do research online, look up John Lash, L-A-S-H, and the word Archons is A-R-C-H-O-N-S, Archons, which means rulers. And they are essentially mind parasites. They affect human consciousness. And John Lash sums up their cause for existence, or their strategy in their dealings with humanity, is that they seek to deter humanity from its true and proper course. So basically, they are the antagonists to human evolution and the divine unfoldment of the human being. So there's a self-designated racial faction who made a pact with the Archons, and so there is a supernatural component behind the Zadokite agenda, the sect which haunted the Qumran caves from which the Dead Sea Scrolls were excavated. To put it into plain English, according to the Gnostic warning, the chosen few who followed the agenda of racial supremacy and domination of the others are proxies of the Archons. Let me say this too, that specifically the place where this Abrahamic religion, Judaism, got compromised was during the Babylonian captivity. During that time, Babylonian Talmud was put together into book form. It had been oral tradition. And basically, we encourage everybody to look into the Talmud, even though that there's a warning that any non-Jew that reads it should be put to death. There's a reason for that, because it is the most intense book of race hatred that has ever existed on planet Earth. It calls for the wholesale domination of all non-Jews by the Jews who self-identify as God's chosen people, that the whole earth God will give to them, that non-Jews, who they call Goy or Goyim, are simply beasts without a soul, chattel or cattle property, that they exist only to serve the Jews. And you know, we will let you explore that for yourself from the Talmud, Talmud. So today we're going to jump back into the prestigious Barnes review that we've been reading from and quoting. Pressure from extremely powerful Zionist sources, as you have already figured out by the title, which is Jews in the Soviet Union by Nobel laureate Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. That pressure from extremely powerful Zionist sources, as you have already figured out by the title, has kept this valuable work from reaching readers in the West. And the reason for that will become obvious once you dive into the issue of the Barnes Review. It details with great precision the Jewish involvement in the creation of Bolshevism and communism, and the willing participation of Jews in perpetrating the worst mass murders of the 20th century, crimes which dwarf claims about the so-called Holocaust. The number of innocent Christian Russians who died at the hands of the Soviets is mind-boggling. Solzhenitsyn himself estimated the toll at 66 million. Many Jews, it must be added, were also crushed under the Soviet steamroller in later years after Joseph Stalin began to diminish their involvement in political and military affairs. So we're going to jump right back in here. Let me pull up my screenshot option. Let's see. We'll get this rocking here where we left off from the first video. And again, thank you for being open-minded and being willing to participate in this exploration of knowledge. Oh boy, okay, what's going on here? Wow. The halls of forever. Okay, so we just want to know that we are, okay, let's stop this screen share and let's try this again because we want you to be able to read along. Okay, so the idea is to, okay, let's try this again. See if we do a share there. Okay. Okay, I think if I stay on here, we'll be just fine. So, where we left off from yesterday, pogroms in the Russian Civil War. Solzhenitsyn does not stint on criticism of pogroms during the Russian Civil War time, especially in Ukraine, which changed overlords several times. White Guardists, Ukrainian independentists, the Kaiser's German troops, and Bolsheviks. However, he corrects erroneous historical representations that claim that the pogroms provoked the subsequent attacks of revenge by the Cheka. Quote, the sequence of events was exactly the opposite. The 80% of the Cheka in Kiev who were Jews had already belonged to the Cheka since 1918 or early 1919. Whereas the wave of the Petliura pogroms, not only during the year 1919, and the pogroms by the whites began only in the autumn of that same year. After the government of independent Ukraine and their party leadership had decided on January 11th, 1918 to separate their country from Russia and evacuated Kiev for Zhytomyr as the Bolsheviks advanced, the very numerous Jews living in Kiev went over immediately to the Reds with their class terror. When evaluating all the events that followed, it remains essential to remember that public calls for mass murder and class terror were issued exclusively by the Bolshevik side. That bears repeating. When evaluating, let me go back a bit more. The very numerous Jews living went over immediately to the Reds, the Bolsheviks, with their class terror. When evaluating all the events that followed, it remains essential to remember that public calls for mass murder and class terror were issued exclusively by the Bolshevik side. On February 9, 1918, Germany officially made peace with Ukraine in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and with Russia on March 3, 1918. In a supplementary agreement of August 27th of that year, the Bolsheviks recognized the national independence of Ukraine, Finland, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. 1 month of Bolshevik rule had sufficed to release enormous revenge feelings among Ukrainians when, as a consequence of the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, the national government was able to return to its capital, Kiev, in February 1918. While returning, militias composed of farmers and Cossacks seized and shot the, quote, Yid commissars, unquote. Ironically, it was the German occupation troops who, as Solzhenitsyn says in his The Jews in the Soviet Union, quote, had an open ear for the needs of the Jewish population in the spring of 1918 in Kiev. Solzhenitsyn adds, this group was by no means insignificant. In 1919, Jews were only 21% of the inhabitants of Kiev. The Zionists were able to be active without hindrance under the hetman, who is the head of the Ukrainian national movement. They held an election for their own provisional Jewish National Assembly and the Jewish National Secretariat. Under German occupation, the Ukrainian government not only appointed a Jew as a government minister, but also granted unfettered political freedom to the Jewish homeland movement. It was only after the departure of German troops and the return of Simon Vasilievich Petlura Directorate from Vinnytsia to Kiev in December 1918 that a civil war-like situation arose against the Jews. Solzhenitsyn adds, the Jews were blamed for all the victories of the Bolsheviks. The excesses against Ukrainian Jews under the Petlura government, Solzhenitsyn mentions an abundance of place names and dates, caused not only terror and mass flight, but also a stronger movement towards the Bolsheviks. Solzhenitsyn says in the Jews in the Soviet Union, between December 1918 and August 1919, combat forces led by Petlura organized dozens of pogroms, during which, according to data compiled by a commissar of the International Red Cross, about 50,000 persons were killed. The largest pogrom took place on February 15, 1919 in Proskurov, after a failed Bolshevik attempt to overthrow the local government. An American researcher attributed the Civil War situation less to the government policy and more to, as Solzhenitsyn affirms, quote, independent reactions by the people themselves and especially the farmers, unquote. Armed bands were arbitrarily doing as they pleased in the countryside. The White Guardists, who served under the generals Peter Wrangel and Anthony Denikin, had volunteered to help free Russia from the Bolsheviks. They quickly developed a fundamentally anti-Semitic attitude after they realized that Red forces had been commanded by Jewish commissars, although their generals endeavored, often in vain, to prevent excesses by their troops. The history of the Russian Civil War is characterized by the fact that after the Bolsheviks imposed an absolute information blackout towards the outside world, as exclusively as possible, all writing on this conflict had been done either by foreign or domestic Jews. As interested parties, both of these furnished are fundamentally unreliable in the data they furnish. Therefore, it is extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain the exact numbers and circumstances. Accordingly, Victim numbers from the pogroms during the Russian Civil War varied between 70,000 and 200,000. There were supposedly 900 mass pogroms, 40% carried out by Petlura followers under the Ukrainian Directorate, 25% by Ukrainian gangs, 17% by enlisted soldiers under General Denikin, and 8.5% by the 1st Cavalry Army of the Bolshevik General Semyon Budyonny. The Reds committed pogroms against Jews earlier than anyone else. In the first winter of Bolshevik rule, troops fighting under the Red Banner committed a number of bloody pogroms, of which those in Ukraine and Glukov and Novgorod Seversky particularly stood out because of the large number of victims, the raw and deliberate acts of violence, and the base humiliations perpetrated on those being tormented. As such, they dwarfed even the atrocious pogrom at Kalush in western Ukraine by non-Bolshevik Russian army troops in July 1917. Units of the Red Army who were retreating from Ukraine in spring 1918 carried out pogroms with the battle cry, quote, "Smash the Yids and the bourgeoisie." Particularly cruel pogroms were perpetrated by the 1st Cavalry Army while retreating from Poland at the end of August 1920. In the vast spaces of Russia, in the beginning, the Reds had no idea who were the virtuous poor and the evil rich. The Zionist Arno Lustiger noted that the Jewish Bolsheviks did not spare their non-Bolshevik brothers in the faith who had not crossed them and inflicted bloody and cruel persecution on them. That bears repeating. The Zionist Arno Lustiger noted that Jewish Bolsheviks did not spare their non-Bolshevik brothers in the faith who had not crossed over and inflicted bloody and cruel persecution on them. Solzhenitsyn again is quoted from the Jews in the Soviet Union. Their path was marked by thousands of killed Jews, thousands of raped women in dozens of Jewish localities in which everything was robbed that was not riveted or nailed down. In Zhytomyr, Ukraine, every new conqueror of the city, as it changed hands, inaugurated his rule with a pogrom. All these pogroms, whether done by Petlura, the Poles, or the Soviets, were distinguished by a considerable number of killings. The total number of pogrom victims from the Civil War of 1917 to 1923 is likely not under 100,000. Let's move up here to the pictures here. Victims of the Red Terror, mass murder across Russia, as they would do years later in World War II when the Bolsheviks retreated from a city. They murdered their prisoners. Clockwise from upper left. 1. Estonian victims of Red torture and murder. 2. Victims of the GPU in Riga. 3. Kiev, Ukraine, 1919. Here are exhumed victims of the Cheka from building number 5 of the Sadovaya, their central headquarters. And 4. Cannibalism resulted from deliberate starvation. Shown is the head of an alleged victim of cannibalism. Solzhenitsyn concludes this chapter with a review of the causative factor of unrestrained procedures by communist revolutionaries who had gone over to the extermination of whole classes and the expropriation of the entire people, robbing everything, plundering, burning, and annihilating anyone who seemed to stand in their way. This lack of restraint and the associated banditry unleashed similarly unrestrained countermoves on other fronts of the Civil War. These should actually be designed one and all as revolutionary excrescences that affected every part of the population instead of applying the special label pogrom to any one subpopulation. The genocidal measures taken by the Red Revolutionaries were an ideologically cloaked, continuous sequence of pogroms against everyone else. Simeon Petlura, by the way, fell victim to a GPU hitman in Paris in 1926. Considerable fluctuation movements in the 20th century. Solzhenitsyn assigned special importance to the Soviet Jewish migration during the 1920s from their rural domiciles into the large cities of Russia. Only this made possible their intensified collaboration in the power centers of the new regime. According to Solzhenitsyn in The Jews in the Soviet Union, quote, "The great exodus of the Jewish population into the large cities began for several reasons in the earliest years of communist power. Some Jewish authors give these concise descriptions. Quote, thousands of Jews streamed out of the shtetls and a few cities in the south towards Moscow, Petrograd, and Kiev toward a real life. Starting in 1917, the Jews moved in hordes to Leningrad and Moscow. The Jewish Encyclopedia gives the following numbers. Hundreds of thousands of Jews moved to Moscow, Leningrad, and into other large urban centers. In 1920, there lived in Moscow about 28,000 Jews. In 1923, about 86,000. In 1926, according to the Soviet census, about 131,000. And in 1933, about 226,000. Jewish communist authors wrote of about 1 million Jewish settlers in the central cities of the new regime, and that in 1923, nearly 50% of the entire Jewish population of Ukraine had moved into the large cities, also into the Russian Federation, into the Trans-Caucasus region, and into Central Asia. Every fifth settler landed in Moscow. This migration was unleashed not only by the enthusiasm of those Jews for Bolshevism, but certainly also for reasons of simple survival. Because under the Leninist and Trotskyite policy of war communism, all private business was forbidden. The craftsman was limited in his activity, and a new category was created, quote, persons with rights. Jews, too, were affected by all this. Whoever, therefore, had not struck firm economical roots made sure he vanished into the anonymity of the large cities to follow the new privileged class. 5/6 of Soviet Jews, quote, selected the staff and landed positions in the communist administration and organization. On a national level, the average percentage of Jews in the communist apparatus in 1925 to 1926, according to their official data, was 6 times higher than their share of the population. A Jewish man by the name of Joseph Bikerman wrote in 1923 of his great concern concerning his ethnic countrymen. Quote, the Jew is now to be found everywhere at every level. The Russian sees him at all points, at the top of the heap, in the ancient capital of Moscow, and in the other capital on the Neva, St. Petersburg, as well as in the Red Army. Russian people see the Jews now in the function of both judge and executioner. He finds Jews at every step and turn, Jews who are not communists, but were just as poor as he still is, but who now have the last word and are advancing Soviet power. This development was furthered from the beginning of the revolution by its merciless fight against the bourgeoisie, the aristocrats, government officials, and military officers under the Tsar, and the entire Russian intelligentsia, educated class, which persecution went so far as denying any entrance into higher education to their children. Thus, the Jews created for themselves a huge privilege. Since this subpopulation, quote, was persecuted under the Tsarist government, unquote, it obtained, even for its own bourgeoisie, unrestricted acceptance into universities. And this ensured that they were qualified thereafter for executive functions within all the activities of the state. The Russian proletarian intellectuals lost out to a large extent. The Jewish Encyclopedia admits, now that there were no more restrictions according to ethnicity for admission to the universities, in the academic year 1926-27, Jews constituted 15.4% of all the students in the USSR, a portion nearly twice as high as that of Jews in the entire urban population of the country. This encyclopedia avoided comparing this percentage to the 1.7, 1.8 of Jew in the overall Soviet population. Many Jews consoled themselves with the idea that instead of taking the dangerous and strenuous road of Zionism with Theodor Herzl and Ziev or Vladimir Jabotinsky, they could, as Solzhenitsyn puts it, quote, rather immediately get a backbone in Russia, and not just an equal footing, but become a privileged nation. That bears repeating. Many Jews console themselves with the idea that instead of taking the dangerous and strenuous road of Zionism with Theodor Herzl and Vladimir Jabotinsky, they could, as Solzhenitsyn puts it, rather immediately get a backbone in Russia and not just an equal footing, but become a privileged nation. It is noteworthy that their activism for Bolshevism, with all its consolations, as they recognized and admitted early on, quote, granted them privileged status. And they claimed this for themselves and their brethren, for then and for the future, as something natural. Equal rights with others were not to their taste. There had to be privileges. Lenin had provided these to them, but Stalin buried all that under his arbitrary rule. The privileging of the Jews brought with it, among other things, the phenomenon that, as Solzhenitsyn says in The Jews in the Soviet Union, quote, incessantly, Jewish relatives streamed into proximity with those who had posts in the power structure of Bolshevism and concomitantly all advantages in practical life, particularly in the capitals with their many apartments and houses from which the owners had fled. Participation in the Red Army. Actually, before we jump to that, let me take a look at this picture here. This is Levi Mekulis, Stalin's hatchet man. Levi, or Lev Mekulis, was an early defector from the Zionist Poal Zion to the Central Committee's Organization Bureau, to Stalin's Secretariat, as well as to the editorial board of Pravda. He replaced J.B. Gamarnik, who committed suicide on June 1st, 1937, as the head and army commissar. First rank of the main political administration of the Red Army, where he was responsible for political commissars. Mekulis was promoted thereafter to first place, representing the People's Commissariat of State Control, and was also Deputy People's Commissar for Defense of the Nation. He was the organizer of the terror against the Red Army. As one of the very few, this purge accomplice survived the Soviet dictator's liquidations, which ripped 35,000 officers through 1937 through 38 out of the Red Army. That was about half of the Soviet officer corps. The Navy did not escape unscathed either. The destruction rate rose with the rank of the victim and attained 80% of colonels and 90% of the generals. The most prominent victim was the Deputy People's Commissar for Defense, Marshal Tukhachevsky, with his battle cry, quote, "Death to the fascist worms," unquote. He ordered the commissar under him in 1941 to murder German prisoners of war. In the New Encyclopedia of Jewry, Bertelsmann Publishing House, Gütersloh, Munich, 1992, the perpetrator, Levi Mekulis, isn't even mentioned. Participation in the Red Army. The founders, the founders of the Red Army in 1918 were Leon Trotsky, E.M. Skylyansky, and Jacob Sverdlov. Their religion and ethnicity, as well as their proletariat class connection, ensured that Bolshevik command personnel, from the very beginning, showed to a large extent homogeneous ancestral traits, and these provided a certain guarantee for anti-Tsarist, anti-Orthodox Christian, and anti-Russian culture and tradition. Not only did many Jews fight in their ranks, but even an all-Jewish Joseph Furman Brigade and other special Jewish units were created, Solzhenitsyn tells us. In the command structure of the Red, the Worker and Farmer Army, Jewish cadres became ever more numerous and more powerful over time. And this continued after the Civil War for many long years. Several Jewish authors and encyclopedias have treated the collaboration of Jews in military leadership. The Israeli researcher Aaron Abramovich created in the 1980s his own detailed lists of names of Jews based on numerous Soviet publications, such as the book 50 Years of the Armed Forces of the USSR. published by the Soviet Historical Encyclopedia, and a collection, Directives of the Front Commands of the Red Army. These lists consisted of Jews only who had occupied leading positions in the Red Army, beginning with the Civil War and through World War II. By order of Leon Trotsky, front commands were formed with appropriate staffs and new armies, and in nearly all the military revolutionary councils of the front commands and armies, Jews were represented. Solzhenitsyn cites from various Jewish authors and mentions a long list of the names and functions of army and division commanders and war commissars with the divisions. Quote, brigade commanders, brigade commissars, regimental and sectional commanders, directors of political departments, chairmen of military revolutionary tribunals. The proportion of Jews as political officers was particularly high in all branches of the Red Army. An Israeli researcher published statistics on the basis of the data contained in the census of 1926. Jewish men represented at that time 1.7% of the total male population of the USSR. 2.1% of the officers who fought in actual combat were Jews. 4.4% in command positions were Jewish. 10.3% Jews among political officers, and 18.6% of the army surgeons were Jewish. The Russian Jewish Encyclopedia augments and further describes much data by Abramovich. Thus, certain, quote, unusual women were also named to assume command functions, among other things as heads of revolutionary committees, political departments, in army operational staffs, and military sections. Solzhenitsyn reveals his contempt for them since they were active in implementing the Red Terror. One of these furies he describes, Rebecca Plastinina Mazel from the Revolutionary Committee of the Archangel government, quote, shot with her own hands 100 human beings and belonged in the 1940s to the highest court of justice in the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic. An Israeli historian confirms that the penetration of the high command structures of the Red Army by Jews, which existed from the beginning, still continued into the 1930s. They were numerous, particularly in the Military Revolutionary Council, in the headquarters of the People's Commissariat for Defense, in the General Staff, and so forth. The same applies to the military districts, the armies, corps, divisions, brigades, and all troop units. From the beginning, Jews occupied high positions in the political agencies. Jewish writers born long after the events often strive to represent Jewish Chekists as, quote, purge victims of Stalin, unquote, and to minimize their own participation in the Red Terror, although their role was still very important, quote, even in the 1940s in the enforcement organs and only in the post-war years when they fell victim to Stalin's, quote, anti-cosmopolitan campaign, were their numbers reduced. While the yearbook Jewish World confesses that during the war, over 100 Jewish generals belonged to the Red Army and ignores all but 17 arbitrarily selected names, among them not one infantry general, it lists, quote, as a bad joke, unquote, with those 17 names, the Jewish major general in charge of the technical service of the Gulag, Frankel Naftali Aronovich. A further Jewish analogy confirmed yet more names from the post-war period. Solzhenitsyn says in The Jews in the Soviet Union, of course the egregious failure in these works was not to have mentioned the super general Levi Mekhilis, who from 1937 to 1940 was Stalin's closest and most trusted friend, and starting in 1941, again became the head of the Purka, the political head office of the Red Worker and Farmer Army. 10 days after the beginning of the war, it's he who had a dozen Soviet generals arrested at the highest levels of the command structure at the Western Front, to say nothing of his retaliatory actions during the Finnish War and later at Kerch in Ukraine. Let's go back here and look at this highlighted section. Jewish writers often strive to represent Jewish Chekists as the, quote, purge victims of Stalin, unquote, and to minimize their own participation in the Red Terror, although their role was very important. 15 more names of Jewish generals are added by the Little Jewish Encyclopedia, 1976, 2005, Jerusalem, Volume 1, page 686. All this, however, is still far exceeded by a more recent Jewish author who arrived at a total figure of 270 Jewish generals and admirals in the Red Army, which included also those promoted during the war to these ranks. These are not only, quote, not a few, unquote, this number is colossal. 270 Jewish generals and admirals in the Red Army. Listed are also 4 wartime people's commissars, besides Kaganovich, also Boris Vanikov, in charge of ammunition manufacturing, Simeon Ginsburg, construction department, and Isaac Salzman, tank production. In addition, there were some Jewish heads of the military administrators of the Red Army, 4 army commanders, and the commanders of 23 corps, 72 divisions, and 102 brigades. In no other Allied army, not even in the American, did Jews hold such high positions as they did in the Soviet army, writes Y. Arad. To speak of pushing out, to speak of a pushing out of Jews from high positions of power during the war would be wrong. And in the Soviet everyday life of that time as well, no such displacement became apparent. The Israeli Encyclopedia confirms that in the USSR, in comparison with other ethnicities, the Jews represented a disproportionately high portion of higher officers, primarily because among them, a much higher percentage consisted of people with a university education. Y. Arad notes, quote, during the war, the number of commissars and political in various departments of the army who were Jewish was relatively higher than in other fields of activity. According to the newspaper Unity of February 24, 1945, nearly at the end of the war, 63,374 Jews were distinguished with a medal or medals for bravery and heroism in the fight, and 59 Jews became heroes of the Soviet Union. Yet by 1963, according to the Yiddish language newspaper Kol Mi Vasar out of Warsaw, 160,772 Jews were awarded a medal, and there were 108 heroes of the Soviet Union. In the beginning of the 1990s, an Israeli author published a list with names and data of recipients of this high award, claiming 135 Jewish heroes of the Soviet Union and 12 Jews who received the Medal of Fame in all 3 categories. The same data is also found in the 3-volume work Descriptions of Jewish Heroism. The newest number of Jews who were distinguished for special achievements in combat with Soviet medals is, however, 123,822. But this is not all. Solzhenitsyn says, many Jews dedicated themselves to the construction of all kinds of weapons and war technology, tool-making, aircraft, tank and ship construction, scientific research, the building and the development of industrial enterprises, power supply, metal production, and transportation. For work, for the front, 180,000 Jews received decorations, 200 of them received the Order of Lenin. Let's jump down to this highlight here. Gerenk Yagoda, terror master. Born Herschel Yehuda, as early as 1920, he was already in the Presidium alongside Cheka director Felix Dzerzhinsky. By 1924, he was a leader of the Cheka and the GPU. Between 1934 and 1936, he was the People's Commissar of the Interior. One of his famous quotes was, quote, "The bullet is the very best means of struggle against the class enemy," unquote. He hated class enemies. Rather, his hated class enemies were the medium and large farmers, the kulaks, and also, quote, suspicious ones, counter-revolutionaries, which were Russians, Ukrainians, Caucasians, and members of other races. He had arranged for the cadre chiefs on almost all levels of the state organs of enforcement to be vengeance-seeking co-religionists. That bears repeating. He had arranged for the cadre chiefs on almost all levels of the state organs of enforcement to be vengeance-seeking co-religionists or fellow Jews. Quote, they craved revenge, revenge on everyone, on aristocrats, the rich, the Russians. The main thing was revenge, unquote. He disposed of, quote, troops for special use, availed himself of bestial methods of overwork and starvation, and exploited the outlaw status of former citizens with assassination and poison. He also counterfeited foreign currencies. On March 15, 1938, after his confession in a show trial, the very best means of class warfare was inflicted on him on Stalin's order. It was under Yagoda's substantial co-responsibility and as a consequence of war communism that just in the hunger winter of 1921 and 22, approximately 5 million human beings perished. Over the course of the forced collectivization of agriculture, it was his responsibility as the People's Commissar of the Interior that another 6 million human beings died. Major General Bakumov, who had surrounded himself with a whole group of Jewish collaborators, was a close and trusted friend of Beria. Bakumov was described by the NKVD's General Sudoplatov as a Jew by birth. He was one of the chief executives responsible for the tremendous crimes of the NKVD-MVD. General Reitman of the NKVD was praised by Echov in the 30s, while head of the Kharkov administrative area of the NKVD, was infamous for his special brutality. In 1940, he played a key role in the Katyn shooting of the Polish officers who were prisoners of war. Twice decorated hero of the Soviet Union, Army General Ivan Danilovich Chernyakovsky, as the commander-in-chief of the Belarusian front, was responsible for atrocities against the civilian population and German prisoners of war in East Prussia. The list could go on and on and on. Jewish commissars were no German invention. The proofs to which Solzhenitsyn refers for the far above average percentage of Jewish leaders in the Bolshevik terror in comparison with the total population of Russia are almost exclusively taken from Jewish sources. That bears repeating. The proofs to which Solzhenitsyn refers for the far above average percentage of Jewish leaders in the Bolshevik terror in comparison with the total population of Russia are almost exclusively taken from Jewish sources. This is a welcome procedure because it extracts him from any credible reproach of anti-Semitism or basic one-sidedness on this subject. Here we limit ourselves to a selection of Solzhenitsyn's general conclusions in order to avoid being crushed by the multiplicity of Jewish commissar names and functions, promotions and transfers to new responsibilities. Quote, it is beyond all doubt that in the party called the Bolsheviks, and in all the other parties that contributed so much to the success of the revolution, the Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, and others, Jews represented a far higher percentage than their proportion of the population of Russia. References to the lack of civil rights of the Russian Jews before the February Revolution give no exhaustive answer by itself to this phenomenon. The majority of Russians, from the simple man, from the people to the highest ranking general, were stunned just to look at all these new orators and leaders of demonstrations and meetings, these persons who now had the final say and abruptly appeared so many and abruptly appeared so different from their leaders in former times. The very trick many of these people used of exchanging their real Jewish names with Russian-sounding aliases and thus misleading the citizenry, mostly the Russians, as Solzhenitsyn explains, quote, greatly vexed them even in the early months after the February Revolution against the Jews. Now a wave of popular anger swept over the Jews, from Solzhenitsyn to the Jews in the Soviet Union. Quote, before our eyes, the most primal anti-Semitism is reborn. One need only listen in Petrograd to discussions on the streetcars in the lines before various businesses, or in any of the innumerable spontaneous demonstrations at every intersection. The Jews were accused of supremacism in politics, and it is said that they were bringing all the parties and the Soviets under their thumb, even destroying the army. It is said even of the executive committee in Petrograd that it is infiltrated by Jews, unquote. Even Solzhenitsyn stresses the October Revolution should be attributed to Russians as such, despite the overall guidance by Trotsky and the energetic assistance of others, since Lenin is considered to be clearly Russian. This does not weaken the details that follow. Quote, Jewish military men played an important role in both the preparation and execution of the armed rebellion of October 1917 in Petrograd and in other cities of the country, and also in the final crushing of the mutinies and armed resistance against the new Soviet regime. The resolution to launch the Bolshevik uprising of October 10, 1917, was made by 12 men, half of whom were Jews: Trotsky, founder of the Red Army; Zinoviev, later chairman of the Communist International, the Comintern; Kamenev, a member of the CC and the Politburo; Sverdlov, director of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee; Uritsky, commissar of the Extraordinary Staff of the Petrograd Military District, murdered shortly thereafter; and Sokolnikov. In the Politburo that was soon to be elected, they were reunited with the exception of Sverdlov and Uritsky. Let's look at this highlighted quote here. In the Bolshevik Party and in all other parties that contributed to the success of the revolution, Jews represented a far higher percentage than their population of the general population of Russia. The Jewish question ranked 10 times higher than issues affecting farmers even at this first Congress of the Soviets on October 27, 1917, which was supposed to be a Congress of workers and deputies of the peasants, and which had issued various decrees about peace and land. Lenin himself referred to this circumstance, quote, what rendered a large service to the revolution was the fact that because of the war, a significant number of Jews who belonged to the mid-level intelligentsia had relocated to the large Russian cities. Only because of this reserve of well-trained and more or less prudent and intelligent new civil servants could we succeed in taking over the state apparatus, thoroughly remaking it. And Solzhenitsyn adds, from the first day, the Bolsheviks brought Jews into the Soviet power apparatus, some in directing positions, others as implementers. It was in any case a mass phenomenon. Thousands of Jews streamed in late 1917 and early 18 into the Bolsheviks' ranks, since they saw in them the most decisive representatives of revolution, the most reliable internationalists, and they formed the majority of the lower layers of the party structure. The creation of Jewish commissariats in 1918 reflected this. It was designed to become a center for the Jewish communist movement. Its task consisted of putting the new urban Jews into the service of communism and smashing all the old organizational structures of conservative Jewry in Russia. The consequence was that an important segment of their leaders crossed over to the Bolsheviks. Stalin later ordered the cruel persecution of these same leaders. But as early as 1920, the Jewish-dominated Cheka Presidium prohibited all Zionist organizations, Zionism being striving for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But as early as 1920, the Jewish-dominated Cheka Presidium prohibited all Zionist organizations as counter-revolutionary and locked up all the participants in the spring of 1920 All-Russian Zionist Conference in Moscow. In the widely cast demonization campaign of the Bolsheviks, which targeted aristocracy, the rich, state officials, and the hired hands of capitalism, officers, priests, monks, nuns, farmers, the kulaks, and all the other, quote, auxiliaries of Tsarism, unquote, the once lowly Jews ended up as the only category that did not make the list. And so they could give their new purgers a boost, which, however, came across to others who knew them as a previously outcast people as overzealous and unscrupulous. This is how they acted. It may be that they encountered the other, the goyim, dehumanizing him because of the tenets of their religion, preserved amongst themselves, however, an unusual level of cooperation. Let's look up here at this highlight. This individual pictured here is Béla Kun, the former Aaron Cohen, a Hungarian national. He proclaimed the dictatorship of the proletariat on March 21st, 1919 in Budapest. After the bloody rule and collapse of his Soviet Republic on August 1st, 1919, he went to Russia and took part after 1920 as a member of the Revolutionary War Council in the Russian Civil War and spent many years participating in Bolshevik purges, to which, just in the Crimea, 60 to 70,000 people fell victim. In 1935, he rose to become a delegate to the Comintern, and on November 30th, 1939, was himself executed. So it was surely no coincidence that the secret services, Cheka and GPU, brutal from the outset and given unrestricted authority, used Jewish regional directors, primarily in Petrograd, Moscow, Odessa, and Kiev, to implement force to an extraordinary extent, aside from the Pole Felix Dzerzhinsky, who had undergone 11 years of Tsarist banishment. An investigation published in 1999 in Moscow revealed, in Kiev, Isaac Schwartz assumed the direction of the 10-member Kiev Cheka collective. Initially, 7 of its members were Jewish. The Cheka personnel in Ukraine, with Ukrainians being 80% of the population, was 75% of Jewish origin. If as late as 1934, the Jewish population percentage of approximately 2%, fully 39% of the top officials of the secret services came from Jewish families, yet from Russian families only 36%, history is entitled to speak of a Jewish supremacy in the secret services. This supremacy was smashed only by Stalin. Solzhenitsyn adds that on January 1st, 1938, their percentage was 27%, and on July 1st, 1939, a mere 4%. And who were its victims? Solzhenitsyn says, quote, "The innumerable shooting victims, those who were sunk in whole ships, the hostages and prisoners, the officers were Russians, the nobles were Russians, the Zemstvo members were Russians, and the farmers who did not want to go into the Red Army and were dragged out of the forests, Russians," unquote. Even the intelligentsia, the well-educated class, that was opposed to anti-Semitism, as well as, of course, the members of the Orthodox Church, were Russian. Besides this, all active anti-Semites were considered outlaws. That is, they could be shot out of hand. They too, all being Russians. I will repeat that. Besides this, all active anti-Semites were considered outlaws. They could be shot out of hand. They too, all being Russians. Even Pravda published an appeal by the workers in Archangels. Everywhere we see that only the Russian Orthodox churches are being defiled, desecrated, and robbed, but not the Jewish synagogues. Deaths by hunger and disease carry off hundreds of thousands of innocent Russian lives, but the Jews do not die of hunger and disease. That bears repeating. Everywhere we see that the Russian Orthodox Christian churches are being defiled, desecrated, and robbed, but not the Jewish synagogues. Deaths by hunger and disease carry off hundreds of thousands of innocent Russian lives, but the Jews do not die of hunger and disease. Solzhenitsyn elaborates in his The Jews in the Soviet Union. In the USSR, the persecution inflicted on Christians exceeded anything that ever happened in the past in both cruelty and extent. That bears repeating. This is Solzhenitsyn speaking, in the USSR, the persecution inflicted on Christians exceeded anything that ever happened in the past in both cruelty and extent. However, one may not burden this entirely on the Jews, but their influence may not be played down either. In the eyes of the whites, the right-wing anti-Bolsheviks, All this promptly and naturally revealed authentic proof of the fusion of Jewry and the Bolsheviks. Even observers from America paid tribute to the dynamic role of the Jews in Bolshevism. In the upward momentum of the October phase, many Jews still spoke with proudly erect heads of their activities for Bolshevism. The participation of the Jews in the revolution and in the Civil War went even beyond their extraordinary participation in the government. It was far more extensive even than that, unquote. Inadvertently, a photo taken at a meeting of the Presidium of the Petrograd Soviet after the October Revolution was published. Jews formed the absolute majority at the Presidium table. In retrospect, one may use the words of the Zionist Arno Lustiger. It is no injustice to identify Bolshevism with the Jews. 3 of 5 members of the Committee for the Revolutionary Defense of Petrograd were Jews: Uritsky, Goldstein, and Drabkin. The chairman of the Soviet there was Trotsky. Later, Zinoviev and Uritsky, all Jews. Of the 8 members of the Revolutionary War Council of the Republic, 5 are Jews: Trotsky, Skylansky, Gusiev, Kamenev, and Unschlilk. The first head of state of the Soviet Republic was Jacob Sverdlov, a Jew, unquote. Solzhenitsyn says, quote, the role of the Jews was particularly remarkable in the agencies responsible for the food supply, unquote. According to Solzhenitsyn, they implemented directives such as these, quote, food requisitioning must be carried out without consideration for the consequences, including the seizure of the entire grain in a village. The producer is only allowed the hunger ration. In putting together the units that requisitioned the farmers' food, they hired former criminal offenders and antisocial elements who had no problem with beating the farmers. The all too open participation of the Jews in the Bolshevik fury directs the eyes of the Russians and of the whole world upon us, unquote. And the highlighted section here, everywhere we see that only the Russian Orthodox Christian churches are being defiled, desecrated, and robbed, but not the synagogues. Hunger and disease carry off hundreds of thousands, but not Jews. I.O. Levin affirmed in his writings on the communist revolutions in Hungary and Bavaria after World War I that the flood of Jews into the Bolshevik camp had hardly anything to do with any preceding suffering. Solzhenitsyn explains, in both countries, the number of Jews who took part in the Bolshevik regime was enormous. In Bavaria, we find among the commissars the Jews Levin, Axelrod, the anarchist ideologue Landauer, and Ernst Toller. In Hungary, Jews represented up to 95% of the leaders in the Bolshevik movement. The legal status of the Jews was excellent in Hungary. For a long time, there had been no legal restrictions. On the contrary, the Jews enjoyed a position that could tempt anti-Semites to speak of Jewish supremacy in the cultural and economic life of Hungary. One should add that these were the conditions in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy of the time, and similar conditions also prevailed to a large extent in Imperial Germany. Solzhenitsyn recognized the international situation correctly in his remarks regarding the Zionists of the east coast of the US, who, independent of Russian events, used their power in 1919 at the Versailles Peace Treaty, which they ignored, to set forth to bring all Western traditions crashing down. His comments, quote, that which united all those insurgent and also many Jews on the other side of the ocean was a sudden flaming up of unchecked revolutionary internationalist fervor, a stormy urge for revolution that they wanted to carry out as a world revolution or even permanent revolution. The rapid advancement of the Jews in the Bolshevik administration naturally did not remain unnoticed among Jews in Europe and in the US, and called for, shamefully, nothing but joyful approval, unquote. Solzhenitsyn wrote, referring to Jewish sources, once again on the immigrants from the US, quote, especially the many Jews, these people displayed a brutality and rigorousness in Russia, with their repressive measures against the middle class. Editor notes that provoked discussion even in the US Senate. They only speak the Russian language badly. The people over whom they had seized power was strange to them, and they behaved like conquerors in a defeated country. Whereas in Tsarist Russia, Jews were not given any important positions, and schools and the civil service were closed to them. There were Jews everywhere in the Soviet republics, in every committee and commissariat. Often they changed their Jewish names into Russian ones, but this masquerade could not deceive anybody. Volume 2, Jews in the Soviet Union, page 111. Let's go up here and take a look at these guys. We've got Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, and Mikhail Kalinin. Photo from the 8th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, March 1919. The Second Party program adopted at its 8th Congress was aimed at the maximum centralization of production, simultaneously striving to establish a unified economic plan. In their commentary on this program, Bukharin and Preobrazhensky explained what lay behind this phrase. They stated that under communism, quote, society will be transformed into a huge working organization for cooperative production. There will then be neither disintegration of production nor anarchy of production. No longer will one enterprise compete with another. The factories, workshops, mines, and other productive institutions will all be subdivisions, as it were, of one vast people's workshop, which will now embrace the entire national economy of production. This is how the organization of communist production will be affected. In other words, Big Brother would control everything. And just a personal comment here, boy, it really sounds like this was a real attempt to implement a new world order type of system in the early part of the 20th century. Solzhenitsyn also refers to an article by the then War Minister of the British Cabinet, Winston Churchill, of February 1920, in the London Illustrated Sunday Herald. Quote, "And now, at last, this brand of extraordinary personalities from the underground of the great cities of Europe and America has gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and has become practically the undisputed master of that enormous Russian Empire." In this connection, Solzhenitsyn mentions that the British intervention troops in the Baku area, quote, shot 26 Bolshevik commissars on September 20th, 1918, in Baku, in the desert on the Caspian Sea, without this exciting the slightest interest on the part of the world public. It never bothered the many humanitarian moral apostles of the Western world that the English were in a hurry to occupy the oil fields of Baku. The authors of the anthology Russia and Russian Jewry, G. Aronson and I. M. Bikerman, confessed in 1924 their worry. Naturally, it is clear that not all Jews are Bolsheviks, and not all Bolsheviks are Jews. But it does not take long to prove how excessively, and above all, how overzealously, Jews took part in the abuse of the half-dead Russia by the Bolsheviks. The Russian people have never before experienced Jews in power. Now, however, one experiences them at every step and turn, and their power is brutal and unlimited. One must understand the psychological reaction of the Russians when they feel themselves suddenly exposed to the power of this whole rotten scum with its arrogance and crudity, its self-centeredness and churlish behavior. When in 1929 the first collectivization of agriculture was introduced, which led to at least 6 million dead by programmed famine, although it was ordered by Stalin, it was carried out by a variegated team of Jewish communist executioners. Solzhenitsyn tells us in The Jews in the Soviet Union, quote, "In the National Planning Authority, Gosplan, Stalin maintained the previous Jewish majority. Of course, J. Larin was among them, the founder of the economics of war communism, and one of the leading lights and theoreticians of collectivization. Levi Krisman began functioning in 1928 as the director of the Agricultural Institute, and from 1931 to 1933, he was the deputy chairman of the Gosplan. Jacob Levi Epstein was the head of the People's Agricultural Commissariat. Afterward, around the end of 1929, he led the Great Reform, the collectivization attack which affected millions, along with the eager fulfillers of his plan. He belonged, together with M. Kalmanovich, to the highest government council for work and defense, whose composition is nearly completely mentioned, with Stalin, Molotov, Mikoyan, Orjonikitsky, and Voroshilov. S. Margolina writes in her book, The End of Lies, besides this, at the end of the 1920s, not a few Jewish communists began showing up for the first time out in the flat country as military commanders and as lords of life and death. It was only over the course of the collectivization that the picture of the Jew as the hated enemy of the farmer was formed, even in areas where no one had ever previously seen a Jew face to face. Solzhenitsyn takes a stand against the view that there was merely a Jewish layer of implementers and stresses that Jews also belonged in no small measure to the dominant class at that time, which after 1937-38 and centered in the large cities, kept the whole enormous country under lock and key, ever forgetting to put forth that the exponent of their idea, Karl Marx, was the creative genius behind the ideas for the communist liberation of mankind. The pitiless and disastrous Lazar Kaganovich, a member after 1930 of the Politburo and head of the Central Committee's Control Commission, and after the mid-1930s CC Secretary, was co-responsible for the forced collectivization of agriculture and for the great purges of 1934 through 38. Solzhenitsyn says that, quote, outside of Stalin, he was the only one at this height. His three brothers in high positions also received Solzhenitsyn's mention. The press, the political administration of the Red Army, and the guidance of the Komsomol, the Communist Youth Organization, lay in Jewish hands. The 8 Jewish People's Commissars in 1936 were also not forgotten. Maxim Litinov, People's Commissar of the Exterior; Genrik Yagoda, People's Commissar of the Interior, 1934-36, shot on March 15, 38 in Moscow. Nicholas Yeshov, People's Commissar of the Interior, after September 27, 1936. His deputy, M. Berman, remained at the same time the head of the National Punishment Camp Administration, the Gulag. His staff of collaborators was ethnically as one may expect. Yeshov was liquidated at the end of 1938. His successor was Beria. Lazar Kaganovich, People's Commissar for Railways; A. Rosenholz, People's Commissar for Foreign Trade; I.J. Weitzer, People's Commissar for Domestic Trade; M. Kalmanovich, People's Commissar for the State Properties; L.J. Lyubimov, People's Commissar for Light Industry; G. Kaminsky, People's Commissar for the Health Service; S. Polensky, Chairman of the Committee for Soviet Control. As Solzhenitsyn says in The Jews in the Soviet Union, quote, we find many Jewish names in the same cabinet on the level of the different deputy people's commissars for finances, radio and telecommunication systems, railways, river transport, agriculture, forestry, foodstuffs, education, and law. The most important deputy people's commissars were Y. Gamarnik, Defense, and A. Garuvik, who made a crucial contribution to the setting up of the metallurgical industry in the USSR, and Simeon Ginsburg, heavy industry, later people's commissar for the building industry, then for armaments factories. Solzhenitsyn also found many Jews in leading positions locally. For example, working as first secretaries on the area committee ruling the Volga Germans and on regional committees in the Far East. 200,000 starving, poorly clothed workers were used to enlarge the Kuznetsker Kombinat, which is the Kuznetsker Collective Combine in the Urals. The control of this hell was in the hands of S. Frankfurter and then I. Epstein. Bolshevik uprisings in post-World War I Germany. At the Comintern congresses in Moscow, one met the elite of the Jewish communists of Soviet Russia. More than one page of names follows in Solzhenitsyn's Book of Jewish Names from Russia and numerous other countries. Motto of the Comintern chairman Zinoviev, quote, "It is not crucial whether we hang the class enemies illegally or legally. The communist parties and also the secret apparatus of the Comintern were substantially shaped by Eastern Europe red assimilators in a whole set of countries." When in 1919 the leaders of the KPD, Communist Party of Germany, namely Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were murdered after their failed Spartacist uprising, their successor was Paul Levi. August Thalheimer took over the editorship of the Red Flag. Its editorship was mainly Jewish Bolshevism, Myth and Reality, page 165. Adolf Jaffe, the first Soviet ambassador to Berlin, made his Central European location into, quote, "the headquarters of the revolution." Leo Flieg ran until 1932 the Secretariat of the Org Office of the CC of the KPD, and at the same time administered as an agent of the Comintern the financing and the millions of revolution that flowed from Moscow to the Soviet embassy in Berlin, as Solzhenitsyn points out, quote, "for the setting up of a Red Army arranged into proletariat hundreds, groups of 100, a concept from ancient Rome, designed to conquer power in Germany according to a guerrilla concept." All of them were ethnic foreigners, just as were the KPD Comintern comrades Ruth Fischer, Heinz Neumann, and among others, Arkady Maslov, born Isaac Chemerinsky in Russia, the German CC in Politburo. The same is true of the internationally operating communist press baron Willy Munzenberg, the GPU boss for Western Europe, Ignaz Reiss, and the Red Chapel boss Leopold Trepper, who out of his Brussels location ran Moscow's European espionage operations and prepared himself early on for his future tasks in World War II. His confession, quote, "I became a communist because I am a Jew." As Solzhenitsyn tells us in his The Jews in the Soviet Union, at the beginning of 1919, the communist councils in German, Räte, led mainly by Jews in Berlin and Munich, carried out their first armed rebellions, and in the KPD at that time, the portion of Jewish activists was disproportionately high, although the Jewish municipality did not particularly support this party. The rebellion in Munich was led by a Jew with a bohemian exterior, the theater critic Kurt Eisner. He was murdered. G. Landauer, Ernst Toller, E. Musam, and O. Neurath proclaimed their new government of leftist Jewish intellectuals in Munich, the Bavarian Soviet Republic. 1 week later, this, quote, republic fell to a still more radical group, which proclaimed itself the Second Bavarian Soviet Republic, at the head of which stood one Eugene Levine. The fact that the leaders of these communist rebellions, suppressed by the army and the volunteer Freikorps, had been Jews was one of the most important causes for the revival of political anti-Semitism in the Germany of the post-World War I revolutionary period. That bears repeating. The fact that the leaders of these communist rebellions, suppressed by the army and the volunteer Freikorps, had been Jews, the leaders had been Jews, was one of the most important causes for the revival of political anti-Semitism in the Germany of the revolutionary period, post-World War I. In any case, members of this minority of 0.7 of the German population became 10% of the key KPD parliamentary group in the German parliament, the Reichstag, by 1925. This is supplemented the significant effect of American Jewry on Germany as part of the Versailles policies of the World War I victors after 1919. One may note the word revival, meaning that there were no serious political anti-Semitism in the Imperial or Kaiser Germany of 1870 to 1918. What Solzhenitsyn forgot to mention was that from the outset, the CPSU and the Comintern, under the direction of Grigory Zinoviev, affected incessantly the the revolts after 1918 in Central Europe with organizational assistance, personnel, and weapons. Of Zinoviev, Solzhenitsyn comments, only thieves concealed their names and used pseudonyms. Only thieves concealed their names and used pseudonyms. By 1923, Zinoviev had already picked out, according to Solzhenitsyn, the future cabinet members of Soviet Germany. A significant group was selected from among various Russian Soviet functionaries, which were to be the core of future German Soviet of People's Commissars. He listed the economic cadres, the military, the Comintern functionaries, and some leading GPU co-workers. Pravda published almost at the same time, 1923, some poetic verses about a Germany in flames. And this nameless chosen one, at that time among the revolutionaries on the Bolshevik Central Committee, enunciated calmly the following modest objective at the 11th Party Congress of the CPSU from March 27th to April 4th, 1922. We possess monopoly on legality. We have refused political liberty to our opponents. We do not permit anyone who wants to compete with us to legally exist. The dictatorship of the proletariat is, as Comrade Lenin says, a very cruel thing. In order to ensure the victory of the dictatorship of the proletariat, we cannot avoid the need to snap the spines of all opponents of this dictatorship. This is satanic. My God, I can't believe I'm reading this stuff. Please. Okay, just going to read that again, if I can get it out. And this nameless chosen one at that time among the revolutionaries on the Bolshevik Central Committee enunciated calmly the following modest objective. We possess the monopoly on legality. We have refused political liberty to our opponents. We do not permit anyone who wants to compete with us to exist legally. The dictatorship of the proletariat is, as Comrade Lenin said, a very cruel thing. In order to ensure the victory of the dictatorship of the proletariat, we cannot avoid the need to snap the spines of all opponents of dictatorship. Solzhenitsyn then swivels over to Hungary, a country of which he notes, quote, the Jews had lived substantially more prosperously than any other Eastern European co-religionist and had enjoyed substantially more success in their careers in Hungarian society. This, Solzhenitsyn points out, would have been something to appreciate about the tolerant Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Quote, the Jews had played a very considerable role in the revolutionary uprisings in Russia and Germany, but their role in Hungary was truly a leading one. Of the 49 People's Commissars, fully 31 were Jews. The primary person among them was Bela Kun, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was in fact the head of the government. 1.5 years later, after the collapse of his uprising in Hungary and his departure, he was to inundate the Crimea with blood. Emigration between the wars. Among the 1.16 million Russian immigrants who escaped the civil war conditions that existed after 1917, were more than 200,000 Jews. Of them, most turned to Poland, Germany, and France for refuge, while some sought admission into Palestine, the US, Canada, and the countries of South America. They did not play their own independent political role, but instead were integrated into the general trends coming out of New York that were steered by international Zionism. While one important participant in the creation of the Red Army, Ephraim Sky Lansky, built up a reputation in Moscow as, quote, the greatest of the diamond dealers. Mrs. Zinoviev, Slata Bernstein Lenina, attempted unsuccessfully a border crossing into Lithuania. The would-be emigre was carrying, quote, jewels valued at several tens of thousands of millions of rubles, which in our economy would be several $billion. The comment of Solzhenitsyn, quote, with all this, we are still attached to the legend that the first revolutionary leaders were selfless idealists. In the Western world, in the meantime, equating Bolshevism with Jewry was becoming, quote, the usual European thinking of the time, as Solzhenitsyn put it. Perhaps in 1922, Dr. Posmanik was too hasty in his opinions, but he wrote, in the whole civilized world, in all nations, and the members of all social classes and political parties, the belief has become stronger that the Jews have played a crucial role in the emergence of Bolshevism and all its formations. Our personal experience has showed us the fact that not only avowed anti-Semites are attached to this opinion, but representatives of public opinion in the democracies are pointing to hard facts, specifically to the role of the Jews in the Bolshevik movement, not only in Russia, but also in Hungary, Germany, and everywhere else where Bolshevism has appeared, unquote. This opinion was fed by the unreserved support for Bolshevism on the part of American Jewry. There, Solzhenitsyn saw prevailing, quote, the opinion that the fall of the Bolsheviks in Russia inevitably would entail for the Jews the danger of a new bloody wave of pogroms and of massive loss of life. With this in mind, Bolshevism is preferred as the lesser evil. It certainly would have been more meaningful to admit that A, heavy consciousness of guilt was in play in considering a change of power, and B, certain power objectives and expectations about building up a dangerous Eastern Front against Germany militated for a positive international reevaluation strengthening Soviet might. When Stalin began with his elimination of Trotsky and his close collaborators, the Trotskyites, and his party began more or less obviously to, quote, purge Jews, and anti-Jewish tendencies in the USSR were echoed in the pages of the Soviet press, this did not overly agitate the, quote, holy warriors on the east coast of the USA, who otherwise were, quote, anxious about the fate of every mistreated Jew in foreign countries. Their calculation was to use the USSR as a power factor against Germany and therefore to sacrifice their ethnic brothers whom Stalin was executing, and the fate of the German Jews was also unimportant. Take a look up here at this highlighted Ephraim Skalansky. Ephraim Skalansky, a physician from a Jewish family, was the pitiless deputy of Trotsky in the Revolutionary War Council. He created the Red Army together with Trotsky and Sverdlov, and participated with General Tukhachevsky and the regional Cheka head Lev Levin in ruthlessly crushing the farmer uprisings. He, quote, drowned, unquote, many believe he was killed at the behest of Stalin in 1925 during a mission to the US. Even in 1939, on the eve of World War II, it cannot be denied that feeling among the Russian Jews abroad was to set their hopes in the inviolability of the Soviet dictatorship. Jewish public opinion in the whole world thus turned against Russia and in favor of the Bolsheviks. The correct conclusion is drawn by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, quote, the fact that in the Jewish milieu, Bolshevism was favored affected the general course of events in Europe. What more need be said? Jews fell under the Bolshevik steamroller too. Under Lenin's new economic policy, NEP, of 1920, which persisted until 27 and allowed certain areas of free trade and business, the Jews of Russia, due to their often good relations with foreign authorities and relief organizations, assumed a privileged position in comparison with the rest of the population in terms of trade and starting new enterprises. In order to stimulate donations and investments from the American Jewish bourgeoisie, the commissars in Moscow also developed a generous resettlement program. According to Solzhenitsyn, quote, initially the plans provided for the resettlement of approximately 100,000 families, or about 20% of the whole Jewish population of the USSR, into the southern Ukraine and into the north of the Crimea. It was intended to establish new Jewish national districts But many refused the opportunities this presented to go into agriculture, despite their continuing unemployment. About half of all Jews who said that they were willing to be resettled actually took up residence in the villages of the new colonies. In Ukraine and in Belarus, about 455,000 hectares, or 1,756 square miles, were made available for Jewish colonization, and in Crimea, 697,000 hectares, or 2,691 square miles. Actually, between 1919 and 1923, more than 23,000 Jews, establishing themselves on lands now standing empty in the proximity of the shtetls and cities of the former Jewish settlement counties to which they had been confined by the czars. Even Jewish journalists abroad found the whole procedure immoral, since the reassigned lands had been expropriated from the former owners. Those who were sitting in prison had been deported into banishment or had already been shot. But at the beginning of the 1930s, when the government tried to take away their gold and valuable jewelry, practically the whole male population became familiar with the interior of the prisons of the GPU. Even in their worst nightmares under the czars, Jewish traders could not have imagined undergoing such things. In order to free themselves from the status of the persons without rights, many Jewish families moved into the large cities. The traders were forced to close their businesses. Even the Jewish agricultural program remained practically without lasting effect because the collectivization of agriculture after 1927 expropriated the new Jewish settlers again, merging under the slogan, internationalization, the Jewish cultures with the non-Jewish ones. As compensation, so to speak, the Committee for the Land Settlement of Jewish Labor devised a project to resettle Jews in general to Birobidzhan, an area as large as Switzerland and located between two tributaries of the Amur River and the Chinese border. In any case, far away from the real centers of power and Western Zionist influences. But there was no escaping from the Bolsheviks' programs to strip people of all ownership and property. One sentence of Solzhenitsyn's is revelatory. The Bolsheviks were luring Jews at that time into resettling in Birobidzhan with the bait that this would protect them from falling into the status of persons without rights. The author describes what awaited them there. The families, sent off with excessive haste, arrived on location and were horrified at the conditions they saw. In the first work year, only 25 farmhouses were built, and only 125 hectares tilled, on none of which seed was sown for the next year. Many did not remain for a long time in Birobidzhan. Of those who arrived over the course of the whole year of 1928, more than half had abandoned Birobidzhan by February 1929. Parallel with the structural changes of 1937, which saw the final end of Lenin's new economic policy within the Communist Party, the overzealous Jewish committees and Jewish sections of various agencies that had existed since 1918 also were dissolved, whereby all national forms of expression of Russian Jewry, including communist outlets, were lost. Let's take a look at this highlight here. But at the beginning of the 1930s, when the government tried to take away their golden jewelry, practically the whole male Jewish population became familiar with the prisons of the GPU. Solzhenitsyn from the Jews in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the closing of the Bolshevik Russian, the Yevsetskaya, the Bolshevik Russian word for Jewish sections, the closing of these sections did not excessively discourage many of the former section members and other Jewish socialists. They remained in the party and state apparatus, and above all, this large number of energetic Jews in the civil service is what the people saw. No matter whether one describes all this with statistics or with a wealth of specific examples, it is not to be denied that a powerful wave of Jews washed into the Soviet bureaucracy of these years. And this was a state where freedom of speech, freedom of trade, and freedom of religion were suppressed, not to mention basic human dignity. In any case, the Jewish culture of the USSR, which should properly be designated as Soviet proletarian culture in the Yiddish language, was, in Solzhenitsyn's words, entirely crushed and plowed under. The autonomous Soviet Jewish school programs also collapsed. Jewish historiography and the Jewish press also shrank substantially between 1928 and 1930, and as early as 1919, the Hebrew language, the rival of Yiddish, was shoved into the category of the counter-revolutionary. Solzhenitsyn says, by 1923, only 2 Zionist organizations were permitted in the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1924, there were so many arrests, although they were brief, and sentences, only between 3 and 10-year camp detention, afterward reduced, that it reached epidemic proportions. Afterward, the Zionists went underground, and this underground movement was finally smashed only at the end of the 1920s. Some of the Zionists remained in detention or in banishment. Quoting Solzhenitsyn, Jewish writers deplored later those immoral, thoughtless, and shameless people from their own ranks in the service of Bolshevism who had torn down valuable, admired, and honored things in Judaism and left behind poverty, suffering, as well as hopelessness. This also concerned, with exceptions, synagogues, prayer shawls, Torah scrolls, prayer books, and religious writings. Solzhenitsyn says, young Jewish writers expressed their enthusiasm over empty synagogues, lonely rabbis who had no more students to instruct, and rascals from the shtetls who turned into feared red commissars. Within 4 years, from 1928 to 1931, 138,000 officials were removed from public service, and of them, 23,000 were classified under the category enemies of Soviet power and lost their citizen rights. From January 1930 to June 31, in the Donetsk region, 48% of all engineers were dismissed or arrested. Those affected were allegedly sabotage specialists. Let's take a look here at Stalin, the world's worst mega murderer. Joseph Stalin is notorious for millions of political murders, 13 million of which were in the terror famine. Victims of the terror famine were chiefly located in the Ukraine and the Kuban steppe. One of the blood purges was against the so-called doctor's plot. Many of the doctors were Jews, as were many other victims of Stalinist purges. However, most victims of Stalin and communism were non-Jews. Different authorities give various figures for the numbers of people killed by Stalin. I.G. Dyadkin estimates 56 to 62 million unnatural deaths for the USSR overall, with 34 to 49 million under Stalin. Norman Davies refers to 50 million killed during 1924 to 1953, excluding World War II war losses. This would divide more or less into 33 million killed pre-war and 17 million after 1939. William Cokerham claims 50 million plus. Roy Medvedev says 40 million. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn says 60 million. A median figure would be 51 million for the entire Stalin era, 20 million during the 30s. The Soviet Union and Communist China appear to be the greatest mega murderers of all history, apparently killing at least 100 million people. Stalin is responsible for at least 43 million of these. Most of these deaths, perhaps around 39 million, are due to lethal forced labor in Gulag and transit thereto. Communist China up to 1987, but mainly from 1949 through the Cultural Revolution, which alone may have seen over 1 million murdered, is the second worst mega murderer. Then there are lesser communist mega murderers such as North Korea, Tito's Yugoslavia, and the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. In sum, the communists have murdered somewhere around 110 million, or near 2/3 of all those killed by all governments and others from 1900 to 1987. Shockingly, the world total is several times the 38 million that have been killed in all last century's international and domestic wars. When Stalin thrust himself forward after the death of Lenin on January 21st, 1924, to the apex of the Bolshevik Party, he had undoubtedly recognized that he faced a powerful phalanx of Jewish functionaries who stuck closely together, and that he would have to skillfully divide them if he wished to not be ground up between them. First, starting out from 1925, he began to gradually push Trotsky out of office, along with his usually young Jewish functionaries under the strategic slogan used at first for tactical anti-atrocity reasons of socialism in one country, build up the Soviet Union's industry and military might first, versus Trotsky's notion of permanent world revolution. Then, after a sensation-causing show trial in 1935, he had G.J. Zinoviev, formerly Apfelbaum, and Levi Kamenev, formerly Rosenfeld, liquidated. By this time, the numbers of top Jewish personnel in the party machinery began to noticeably thin, although, as Solzhenitsyn says, the purges of the years 1930 through 33 had been aimed primarily at Russian elements in the party. The cleansing waves, or purges, initiated by Stalin in the years 37 through 38, also brought down many Jews. It was only the publication of the biographic volumes of the New Russian Jewish Encyclopedia and the Great Jewish National Biography that has made known to us today so very many names and affiliations with Jewry of once prominent Jewish Chekists, GPU, and NKVD personnel, officers of the Red Army, party officials, and diplomats. Stalin's purges, the glorifying word used for extermination that the Western press immediately adopted as their own, not only had a tremendous lasting effect on the party, but also on the entire state apparatus, including the highest governing bodies. Even if they were not targeting people in an anti-Semitic way, nevertheless, they even-handedly and in a hard-to-understand way, without revealing the governing principle, affected a large number of active communist Jews. There was no reaction in Russia or abroad to this wave of elimination of Jews. Stalin could apparently permit himself anything without losing his international reputation as the, quote, little father of the paradise of workers and farmers. Solzhenitsyn tells us the commanders of the Red Army also came in great number under the steamroller. In the summer of 1938, without exception, all the commanders in the military districts who had taken up these posts in the year 1937 had disappeared without a trace. The political administration of the Red Army suffered its largest losses during the personnel destruction campaign of 1937 after the terrorized Gemarnik, or People's Commissar for Defense, committed suicide. In terms of the political collaborators, all 17 Army commissars died, 25 of 28 Corps commissars, and 34 of 36 brigade and division commissars. We can recognize in the lists now published of the military commanders shot in 1937 and 38 a considerable percentage of Jews. Solzhenitsyn presents a long list of prominent Jewish names in the Soviet Party, diplomacy, economy, and military, including their specific careers up to high military leadership positions that they occupied through 1941. Another victim was the Civil War terrorist and later front commander Gregory Stern, who in March 1939, before the 18th Party Congress had eagerly announced, together we have destroyed a little heap of all sorts of crap. All these Tukhachevskys, like Michael N., Marshal, Deputy War Commissioner, Gemarniks, Defense Commissar, Uborovics, Irenaeus, General, Military Commander of the Belarus region, and similar lowlifes. Another one who did not escape the Cheka firing squad was the Red Spain fighter and later commander, as well as inspector of the Red Air Fleet, Jacob Smushkevich. They had all certainly worked their way up the ranks through the terror. Thus, one reads about Marshal M.N. Tukhachevsky, who was the general responsible in 1921 for the liquidation operations against 50,000, quote, bandits, who were actually anti-Soviet resistance farmers, of Alexander Antonov in the province of Tambov. Quote, he pulled out all stops, the taking of hostages, executions, internment in concentration camps, extermination by poisonous gas, and deportation of whole villages, unquote. Let's jump up to this highlighted word section here. Solzhenitsyn supplements his enumerations of those shot with a long list of prominent Jewish names in the Soviet Party, diplomacy, economy, and military positions of rank and leadership. His order of the day, number 171, of June 11th, 1921, demanded that subordinates proceed pitilessly to shoot everyone who does not give his name or reveal hidden weapons, and to shoot hostages, treat families as bandits who had granted refuge to anti-communist fighters, and to take refugees' property or to burn down their houses. One day after this, Marshal Tukhachevsky added a further order: the poison gassing of the rebels. The forests where the bandits are hiding are to be cleared by the use of poison gas. This must be carefully calculated so that the layer of gas penetrates the forests and kills everyone hiding there. The inspector of the artillery must immediately order the necessary quantities of poison gas and bring up the specialists who are competent for such operations. His extermination order, number 171, had to be withdrawn on July 19th on higher orders. But such brutal procedures were the usual practice at that time for Bolshevik troops, and obviously also the most important reason for his later promotion to the head of the General Staff of the Red Army and to Marshal. If by 1930 the Jewish section of the CC of the party had been already closed during the process of the Yeshovina purge of 1937-38, its prominent functionaries were also arrested and soon thereafter liquidated. Many Yevsektia members also came under the steamroller, who had held leading positions in the central and local departments of the All-Union Society for the Agricultural Resettlement of Jewish Workers, as well as in the social, cultural, and educational institutions of Soviet Jewry. The Jewish school and training systems also came under repression. Jewish scientific institutions were closed, and Jewish writers and artists, however eccentric and degenerate their styles, were not spared. The din surrounding the construction of socialism drowned out all suspicions of anti-Semitism. Solzhenitsyn also reminds us of the fates of many Russian Jewish socialists who had not followed the Bolsheviks or had even fought against them. An accounting of those victims would distract from the fact that a great number of the perpetrators of Jewish origins were still in charge during the years 1937 to 1939, from Yeshov to finally Beria. Let's take a look at this highlighted section. The royal family murdering the royal Romanovs. In the night of July 16th through 17th, 1918, a squad of Bolshevik secret police murdered Russia's last emperor, Tsar Nicholas II, officially also the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Finland, plus his wife, Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, and their 14-year-old son, Tsarevich Alexis. Their 4 daughters, all Grand Duchesses, were also killed. They were Olga, Maria, Anastasia, and Tatiana. All were cut down in a hail of gunfire in a cellar room of a house in Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountain region. The daughters were killed with bayonets after bullets allegedly bounced off jewels they had hidden in their corsets. In 1990, Moscow playwright and historian Edward Radzinski announced the result of his detailed investigation into the murders. He unearthed the reminiscences of Lenin's bodyguard, Alexei Akimov, who recounted how he personally delivered Lenin's execution order to the telegraph office. The telegram was also signed by Soviet government chief Yakov Sverdlov. Akimov saved the original telegraph tape as a record of the secret order. A similar repression also hit 2/3 of the exiled German anti-fascists living in the USSR, and the Polish Communist Party was completely liquidated. These numbers became accessible after Nikita Khrushchev ordered studies done at the 22nd Party Congress of the CPSU in 1956. In Solzhenitsyn's handling of the true extent of the persecution of Jews during the Yeshiva era in 1937 to 1938, based on what he found in the Jewish encyclopedias and other books by Jewish authors, Solzhenitsyn began to have doubts and to notice contradictions. On the one hand, Solzhenitsyn refers to the dissolution that was ordered in 1938 of the Jewish sections of the Communist Party, sections which had existed for many years. Solzhenitsyn refers to, quote, the across-the-board arrests of high Yevsetskaya functionaries in Moscow, as well as of the whole upper level of the administration of the Jewish Resettlement Organization. Solzhenitsyn then quotes an S. Schwartz, who had written, quote, in the context of the purge, nearly all Jewish communists left the stage who had played any important roles, unquote. The Jews in the Soviet Union, page 339. Then the great Russian author refers to the Book of Russian Jewry, which claimed that, quote, after the Yeshov terror in the Soviet Union, not one personality of any name in Jewish public life, in journalism, culture, or even science remained free. A recent historian even opines that of the over 50% Jews among the most important NKVD apparatchiks, by January 1939, only 6% remained. This purge ratio with a remainder of only 6% might be a substantial exaggeration on the part of interested parties intent on highlighting their role, as usual, as victims, and making the reader forget their own terrible complicity in communist crimes. Solzhenitsyn opposes this, the fact that 500,000 Jews have remained state officials at the same time, occasionally in important positions, and the influx of Jewish migrants continued, particularly from Ukraine into Moscow. In addition, he brings up the incredible preference for Jews in the education system, which had begun in 1917. Quote, in 1935, the Jewish percentage of college students was nearly 7 times the Jewish percentage of the country as a whole. In 1929, 13.5% of all students at the universities of the USSR were Jews. In 1933, 12.2%. In 1936, 13.3%. Of doctoral students, there were 18% with a Jewish portion of 1.8% of the population. Volume 2, The Jews in the Soviet Union, page 331. The effect this had on the composition of the leadership class in all areas of state activity was, as anyone would expect. In the Little Jewish Encyclopedia, however, without, of course, indicating the true reason, continuous revolutionary terror, for the high Jewish ratios in comparison to their population average of 1.8%, we read, countrywide, by the end of the 1920s, already 13.6% of those active in the sciences were Jews. In 1937, already 17.6%. In 1939, they represented over 15,000 scientists and university professors, for instance, 15.7% of those so employed. Solzhenitsyn mentions further examples from culture and the press, as well as those who daily churned out atrocious propaganda. He raises the issue of, quote, an ocean of vile brochures meant to make idiots of the masses. Volume 2, Jews in the Soviet Union, page 336. Quote, among the film directors of the 30s, Jews formed a clear majority. Who was being suppressed here? The viewer being treated as a fool with his soul flattened with lies and crude didactics, or the directors who manufactured falsified movie biographies, pseudo-historical movies, and current events propaganda films with all their inflated monumentality and inner emptiness, unquote. The Jewish Encyclopedia notes, quote, an inconceivable number of Jews, cameramen, and directors made popular science movies, instructional and documentary films. These were the Soviet films that were the most strongly affected by the state, and here a skillful cutting and splicing technique permitted them to present tendentiously arranged materials as genuine film documents. The official Soviet atmosphere of the 30s was completely free of animosity toward Jews, and until the beginning of war in 1939, right after Stalin signed his non-aggression pact with Hitler, an overwhelming majority of Soviet Jews probably remained well-disposed toward the Soviet ideology. At this point, Solzhenitsyn comes back to Grigory Aronson, and on page 140, throws one statement back at him. The Jews were not robbed of their general citizen rights. They continued to occupy posts in the state and party machinery and in the diplomatic corps, as among the army generals and the university professors, there were still some Jews. Thus, we enter the year 1939. Let's highlight a quote here. In the context of the purge, nearly all Jewish communists left the stage. After the Yeshav terror, not one person of any name in Jewish public life, in journalism, culture, or science remained free. Solzhenitsyn found the summarizing confession of the Jewish Encyclopedia impressive. Quote, it was precisely at the end of the 1930s that the Jews reached the height of their importance in the different areas of life in Soviet society within the whole area that Soviet power existed. But it was during this high point that, as historical science proves, there were 40 million victims of political terror, among whom should not be overlooked. There were at least some thousands, if not more, hapless Jewish victims. Here, Solzhenitsyn has correctly recognized that doubts are appropriate about the representations of the Jewish encyclopedias and all the authors who write the history of their own brethren in connection with the Stalin era. After all, they stand before the delicate task of explaining to the world why their brethren served the Bolshevik system and from the outset could support those responsible for the persecutions. That bears repeating. Here, Solzhenitsyn has correctly recognized that doubts are appropriate about the representations of the Jewish encyclopedias and all the authors who write the history of their own brethren in connection with the Stalinist era. After all, they stand before the delicate task of explaining to the world why their brethren served the Bolshevik system, and from the outset could support those responsible for the persecutions. It could not have been for humanitarianism, for the Red Terror of Lenin and Stalin was its exact opposite. The very concealment and playing down of these singular crimes, which were world historical in their nature and scope, could not forever remain hidden as to the methods, the order of magnitude, and the perpetrators. And assignments of blame to others are unconvincing. And so they become entangled in constant contradictions and lies, on the one hand praising their, quote, clever brethren, unquote, so numerous in high state positions, in the economy, in academic occupations, receiving titles and medals, and on the other hand, attempt to serve their mandatory role as poor victims who need the compassion of the world. After all, post-war, they have to display without reservation their enthusiasm for the, quote, great peace-loving Soviet Union in its, quote, liberation struggle for civilization, unquote, and with, quote, its Jewish heroes of the Soviet Union, unquote. This was necessary to maintain their dogmatic and singular defamation of nationalist socialist Germany and drive from the consciousness of mankind the incredible performance of the Third Reich during the peace years in building a solid, happy country. For all that, one fact remains. The Germans did not first bring up this small people in their evaluation of Bolshevism. It was the Russians themselves and the other peoples of the world. Let's take a look here at the Ukrainian independence movement. It actually predated the Stalin era. Ukraine, which is about the size of France, had been under the domination of the Tsars of Russia for 200 years. With the collapse of Russian rule in March 1917, it seemed the long-awaited opportunity for independence had finally arrived. Ukrainians declared their country to be an independent republic and reestablished their ancient capital city of Kiev as their seat of government. However, by the end of 1917, Vladimir Lenin sought to reclaim all the areas formerly controlled by the Tsars, especially Ukraine. As a result, 4 years of chaos and conflict followed in which Ukrainian nationalist troops fought against Lenin's Red Army and also against Russia's White Army, troops still loyal to the Tsar, as well as other invading forces, including the Germans and Poles. By 1921, the battle ended with a Soviet victory, but the resistance continued. The people refused to become cogs in the Soviet farm machine and remained stubbornly determined to return to their pre-Soviet farming style. Some refused to work at all, leaving the wheat and oats to rot in unharvested fields. Once again, they were placing themselves in conflict with Stalin. Stalin responded to their unyielding defiance by dictating a policy that would deliberately cause mass starvation and result in the deaths of millions. An estimated 7 to 10 million persons perished in the farming area of Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, with the people deprived of the food they had grown with their own hands. Shown are victims of the terror famine. at war with Germany. This topic undoubtedly was too much for Solzhenitsyn. He did not investigate it as a researcher, but instead copied everything unverified from Jewish sources, in certain cases from Pravda and Izvestia, from 3 Russian books, as well as from the proceedings of the Nuremberg military tribunal held by the victors in 1945 and 46. For this whole chapter with its 179 footnotes, he did not consult one single neutral or German historical source. This is extraordinarily shameful for this man whom we otherwise must highly respect. Here he remains a captain of the Red Army that marched in 1945 into East Prussia. Thus he serves up all our, quote, old acquaintances, the tales from Allied re-education literature, as if they were proven historical facts. The fact that they have long been scientifically disproved, or that any further examination and doubting of certain happenings is punishment in the Federal Republic of Germany by up to 5 years in prison, is something that Solzhenitsyn does not mention with one word. Therefore, one can argue this chapter with its 45 pages and 179 source references without comment as unsubstantiated, were there not details placed to the fore over and over again of which the reader cannot be expected to have specific knowledge and concerning which he gets no reference points for testing these details. Besides this, the normal reader does not expect the sudden break in style between the previous excellent source investigations and the subsequent unchecked copying from party publications and superficial propaganda. Quote, "The systematically accomplished plan for the destruction of millions of Jewish lives, Volume 2, The Jews in the Soviet Union, is a, quote, plan neither submitted for inspection by Solzhenitsyn, nor described, nor examined on the basis of concrete facts, but simply claimed by him under the motto, we assume from the fact that, ... Volume 2, The Jews in Soviet Union, page 393. The author also does not refer to the fact that there has not been one international investigation of this momentous topic, neither during the war nor afterward. The beginning of the Russia campaign, we are here told, rang in a new phase for German National Socialism, quote, the total physical destruction of the Jews. Here already Solzhenitsyn has demonstrably shot himself in the foot. Case number 1. On pages 404 through 536, he concerns himself with all the many Jewish survivors in Russia and occasionally also the rest of Eastern Europe. We read that those Jews willing to emigrate to Palestine were offered the former Volga Republic. We learn that Jewish requests to have the Crimea are being studied, and that in 1946 through 47, 5,000 to 6,000 Jewish settlers from the Ukraine were sent to Bijan. But let us stay first in the year 1941. Solzhenitsyn confirms with various proofs, even from a number of Jewish sources, that the Soviet leadership, after the beginning of the war there on June 22, 1941, gave orders for the preferential evacuation of the Jews from the western border districts issue and to move with, quote, many thousands of train cars and many thousands of carts, 1 to 1.1 million Jews into safer hinterland production areas. The refugee ratio of 8% was surely not reached everywhere, but the efforts for Jewish evacuation probably approximated this figure. Stuart Kahan confirms the preferential evacuation of Jews in his biography of Lazar Kaganovich. At the urging of Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin ordered the evacuation of all persons living in the border areas, particularly Jews, who made up most of the area. Stalin did not love the Jews, but the order they received was to burn their houses down, kill their livestock, and retreat to the interior of Russia. It was far better to know that the Jews were in the Russian hinterland and leave Hitler nothing, rather than to hand them over to him as work slaves as well as their livestock, food supplies, and other materials. The Wolf of the Kremlin, page 205. Look at this highlighted word quote here. It was far better to know that the Jews were in the Russian hinterland and leave Hitler nothing, rather than to hand them over to him as work slaves as well as their livestock, food supplies, and materials. Solzhenitsyn notes that there are Jewish writers such as Schwartz and later researchers who deny both the existence of such an instruction and the evacuation of the Jews as such by the Soviet government, with the argument that this never happened or that this never appeared in the press. The latter is true. but has only formal significance in Soviet practice. After all, the hunger holocaust of the Ukrainians and other peoples with millions of dead and many other important happenings never appeared in Soviet press. Solzhenitsyn adds, however, both the early and later sources give quite similar estimations as to the numbers of Jews who fled or were evacuated from the areas occupied by the Germans. Official Soviet statistics on this are lacking. Of the approximately 3,080,000 Jews who lived in 1941 in the area of the old pre-World War II USSR, 900,000 lived beyond the German invasion area, so that before the evacuation, 2,180,000 were present within the German Army's operations area range. The Jews to be added to this number from Eastern Poland and the Baltic states were an estimated 1,885,000. Of these, only 10 to 12% could escape or be evacuated. Either the percentage indicated by Solzhenitsyn must have been substantially higher, or the number of evacuated Russian Jews actually must have reached 2 million, because he arrives at a total number of Jewish evacuees, including refugees, although this is according to the optimistic calculation of 2,226,000. Let's go back here and take a look. This picture looks like we have Russian Premier Vladimir Putin shaking hands with our good man Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, a devout Christian, appears to have been a firm supporter of Russian President Vladimir Putin. On June 5, 2007, Putin signed a decree conferring State Prize of the Russian Federation for the humanitarian work of Solzhenitsyn. Here, President Putin personally visits the writer at his home on June 12, 2007, to give him the award. Solzhenitsyn defended the regime of former KGB Colonel Putin and actively supported Putin's assertive foreign policy. Putin described Solzhenitsyn as a strong, courageous person with enormous dignity. The two men shared a vision of Russia as a restored state, a state that would play a central role as a respected nation in the world community. But their vision of how to achieve this was different. Solzhenitsyn remained attached to a romantic notion of Russia's greatness and spiritual revival. Putin believes in a strong state, but one committed to continuing reform, a market economy, and human rights. It is a vision that would in some ways be at home in the West. Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia after becoming disillusioned with what he considered the spiritual vacuum of the materialistic West. Said Putin of the former dissident, quote, "His activities as a writer and public figure, his entire long, thorny life journey will remain for us a model of true devotion, selfless service to the people, motherland, the ideals of freedom, justice, and humanism." Solzhenitsyn had recently spoken out against many of Putin's policies. He criticized Putin for not removing the immunity from prosecution enjoyed by Russia's parliamentarians. Solzhenitsyn died August 3, 2008, at the age of 89, just as TBR was preparing to go to the press. The documents of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee confirm approximately 1.5 million Jewish evacuees who went to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and other Central Asian republics. This does not include the Volga region. Using Solzhenitsyn's numbers, there lived, in the later German-occupied part of the Soviet Union, 2,180,000 Jews, adding 1,885,000 from Eastern Poland and the Baltic states. The total is 4,065,000. Subtracting 2,226,000 who were evacuated by the communists into the interior of the Soviet Union, it left, according to Solzhenitsyn, 1,839,000 Jews under German control. However, using the number of 1,500,000 evacuees from the JAFK report, 2,565,000 were actually left. This figure remains unstated by Solzhenitsyn, but the reality is the crucial one. And it caused Jewish authors who came decades too late to deny out of hand the whole Jewish evacuation to the Russian hinterland. For how otherwise should their 6 million murdered Jews figure come off? Solzhenitsyn, however, calls any questioning or even minimalizing of the extensive Jewish evacuation perfectly unjustified. In any case, between June and November 1941, approximately 12 million people, as well as industrial plants, raw materials, and also cattle, were removed in time from the areas threatened by German troops. Starting in 1946, the Communist Party began a campaign against anti-Semitism and accustomed the population gradually to the fact that Jews were moving up into crucial posts in the most varying spheres of activity in the Soviet governmental and economic decision centers. When right after the war, Polish citizens were conducted back to Poland, many non-Polish Jews exploited this opportunity and went along with them. In the Polish puppet government of the post-war period, in the civil service, and in Polish state security, there arose a large predominance of Jews, which later would have serious consequences for the mass of genuine Polish Jews. Completely local conflicts also developed after the other Soviet-occupied countries of Eastern Europe. In all these countries, Jews played a very significant role in the economic life. The Jews who returned demanded the return of their enterprises the Jews who had returned demanded the return of their enterprises if they had not been nationalized by the communists. That led to a new upsurge in hostility toward the Jews. One may note here not only a pushing forward of Jews in 1945 into leading positions in the Eastern European satellite states, but also the presence in them of, quote, a mass of Polish Jews. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee continued to exist, and there arose a growing and spreading Jewish movement. In Russia, so many nationalist feelings began bubbling that as a result that, apparently frightened, Stalin changed decisively his favorable policy towards the Jews after the end of 1948. Solzhenitsyn elaborates on the banishment of mass numbers of Jews from the political realm. Quote, at the beginning of the Cold War, the USSR's discrimination against the Jews became one of the major cards of the anti-Soviet West played against Stalin. In January 1948, Stalin ordered the displacement of the Jews from Soviet culture in a major diversionary maneuver. What was worse for them, the displacement of the Jews from important areas of production, administration, culture, and ideology in 1948 and 1953 assumed, quote, a never previously seen extent. The main blow during the purge was directed against the relatively numerous middle layer of the Jewish elite, against the administrative employees, as well as the journalists, professors, and other representatives of the creative intelligentsia. However, if one examines the figures for the scientific cadres, the statistics look as follows. Jews accounted for 13.6% of all scientists in the country by the end of the 1920s. By 1937, this number had risen to 17.5%, and in 1950 had sunk only to 5.4%. There were 25,125 Jews among the 162,508 scientific workers in the USSR. Let's take a look at the highlight here. Solzhenitsyn estimates less than 2 million Jews remained under German control. This figure begs the question, how then did the Germans manage to Holocaust 4 million non-existent Jews? Let's look here, the Black Ravens. These Black Ravens, as the Muscovites called them, transported prisoners from the Chekas Lubyanka headquarters into the infamous jails of Lefortovo or Butrika, both also in Moscow. The Black Ravens look similar to those poison gas wagons camouflaged as delivery vans for bakery shops, by whose uncounted kulaks were killed at the beginning of the 1930s in the USSR while being driven from the prisons. The former Red Army General Peter Grigorenko, who himself was later arrested, described them in his memoirs. On the other hand, in 1953, nearly all Jewish generals and about 300 colonels and colonels were sent into retirement. Two facts seem important from the time after Stalin's death. One, after Stalin's death, many Jews who had lost their jobs would return. During the thaw phase, many of the old Zionists were released from the Gulag camps. Thus, we read once again of many whole groups. 2. A countrywide census in 1959 in the USSR indicated that 2,268,000 Jews lived there. However, there are also voices warning not to trust this number. Quote, "It is well known that there are more Jews in the USSR than the census indicated," unquote. For the count, a Jew would indicate his desired nationality, not in the nationality listed in his passport. How could this high Soviet Jewish number be possible if the Eastern European and Russian Jews had been totally destroyed in World War II? Case 2. During the entire German-Soviet war, there were only, quote, "a few public mentions of the fate of the Jews in the German-occupied areas." This is all the more amazing since the main Soviet mass murder advocate, Ilya Ehrenberg, was, quote, "proud to be a Jew," unquote. And in all the psychopathic excesses of his flaming hate propaganda against the German people, the Jewish topic was an additional personal priority. We read in a Stalin speech of November 6, 1941, without reference to any specific incident, "The Nazis organized medieval anti-Jewish pogroms just as gladly as did the Tsarist regime. Hitler's party is a party of medieval reaction and of pogroms like the Black Hundreds." From roughly 1900 to 1917, the Black Hundreds and their street activists, the Yellow Shirts, verbally and physically attacked leftist revolutionaries and Jews. This was the only time before May 8, 1945, the date of the German surrender, when the Generalissimo publicly addressed this topic. B. On January 7, 1942, Izvestia cited a report from Foreign Commissar Vyacheslav Molotov, according to which German troops supposedly shot Jews in numerous places such as Kiev, Lvov or Lemberg in German, Odessa, and Kamenets-Podolsk. Molotov gave numbers but no details as to place, with the exception of Kiev. There it was claimed, quote, "in a terrible slaughter, women and children of all age groups were driven together, stripped naked, and were beaten before they were all shot with machine pistols." None of these data were verifiable, contained exact localities, dates, or names of the persons responsible or of the informants. The case of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, where Moscow rulers had not yet begun pointing the finger at the ravine of Babi Yar, later on was fleshed out with, at first, 33,771 shot, allegedly under the guidance of SS Colonel Paul Blobel and his Einsatzkommando. By the end of the war, this figure had expanded to over 100,000, but all of this turned out to be a crude wartime lie. No mass remains of corpses could be found. The Soviets did not even look for them. Instead, immediately after the Red Army returned to Kiev, the scene of the crime was chosen as a city garbage dump. The best, although most macabre, method of making any international examination commissions impossible. After 1945, a giant monument was erected in Kiev to the memory of those murdered by the fascists at Babi Yar. But that chiseling in stone does not substitute for hard proof of murder. As concerns the remaining places specified by Molotov or by others in subsequent years, after conquering back these areas, the Soviet Union has never carried out or permitted any internationally supervised investigations. Not one mass grave has been presented after 1945 to the international public with proved German responsibility. Solzhenitsyn does not write this, but it is a historical fact that he should have considered and expressed. C. On December 19, 1942, the Soviet Union signaled, in accord with the International Declaration of the United Nations, as is well known, from the outset, the UN was an organization of the Allied War Coalition. The so-named declaration had been put together under the influence of the Jewish World Congress and the Jewish Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. With the help of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Morgenthau, as is well known, exercised an extraordinarily strong effect on U.S. foreign policy while skirting the U.S. Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. This international declaration was not the result of concrete investigations or knowledge, but was designed exclusively for its influence as war propaganda. That is another thing that Solzhenitsyn does not write, but it follows from the declaration's content. Said international declaration refers to an imaginary, quote, plan of Hitler to exterminate, quote, European Jewry, unquote. This plan, however, has never been found, and all its claimed horrors have left no traces behind. They remain thus the mere claims of a war party, one that later proudly trumpeted the organization and effect of its black propaganda. This was a typical example of what the British chief propagandist Sefter Delmar admitted, quote, lying from morning till night, unquote. He explained the official principle of his actions, quote, precision first and in all things, lying, fraud, everything is permitted. What has proved best, if possible, is to put words into a dead man's mouth, unquote. This corresponded exactly to the case inserted into the dogma world of dialectic materialism and the interests of the USSR. Solzhenitsyn examines neither the contents of this declaration nor the methods of communist ideology, which made lies, fraud, and dictatorial arbitrariness without any consideration for humanity, the mandatory basic principle of the actions of the state. On the other hand, he expressed surprise that this international declaration remained vague and unspecific and did not trigger the usual series of notices and articles in the Soviet press. D. The thematic silence about the Jews in Moscow's war journalism went even beyond the end of the war, excepting that of Ilya Ehrenberg, who suddenly on January 4th, 1945, 23 days before the liberation of Auschwitz, and unaware of what happened there, denounced the murder of 6 million Jews. The Soviet Commission of Inquiry report on Auschwitz of May 7, 1945 did not mention any destruction of Jews, but only of citizens of the Soviet Union and many other European states. So this highlight here, Vyacheslav Molotov was Stalin's trusted henchman, helping to purge many oppositionists. Throughout the 1930s, he was the formal head of the Soviet government and was the only prominent old Bolshevik to survive the purges, no doubt due to his fanatical loyalties to Stalin. He even signed the arrest order for his own wife. During the Winter War, Molotov claimed that the Soviet Union was not dropping bombs, but rather delivering food to the starving Finns. So the Finns started to call the bombs Molotov breadbaskets. Soon they responded by attacking advancing tanks with Molotov cocktails. Case 3. In the year 1943, the Special Commission to investigate the crimes of Hitler issued 7 reports to the public. The German uncovering in 1941 of the Soviet mass murder in Katyn Forest the previous year had incited Moscow to an immediate propagandist counteroffensive. On Stalin's instructions, in April and May 1940, Leventry, Beria, and his NKVD people murdered over 4,500 imprisoned Polish officers in their camp at Kosielsk, about 250 kilometers or 150 miles southeast of Smolensk, now in Belarus. The German armed forces opened this mass murder site to the international public after they learned of it in April 1943. Another 100,000 missing Polish officers from the Soviet camps, Starobielsk and Oshchakov, were not, however, found at that time. This connection, the whole case of Katyn, is not even mentioned by Solzhenitsyn. Yet it is essential in any evaluation of the 1943 Soviet propaganda initiative called the Special Commission. But it is notable that Solzhenitsyn did emphasize that of these 7 Soviet reports, quote, where individual locations and acts of extermination of Russian prisoners of war and destruction of cultural monuments were investigated, only one report concerned itself with the Jews, who were, quote, killed in the Stavropol region, northern Caucasus, near the city of Mineralnye Vody. But no one has ever heard of this supposed massacre again. Case 4. Solzhenitsyn also noticed that during a speech by Nikita Khrushchev in Kiev in March 1944, the topic being the sufferings of those who had to live through the occupation, the German occupation in Ukraine. Quote, the Jews were not mentioned, unquote. Thus Khrushchev, this exponent in the Ukraine for many years of Moscow rule. From 1938 to 49, he was the first party secretary and chairman of the Soviet of People's Commissars of the Ukraine, and after 1934, even a member of the Central Committee of the CPSU, never took seriously himself the story about Babi Yar and the alleged murder of 33,771 Jews. That was later increased to 100,000. Since in March 1944, he was not speaking as a private person, but as a party official and lieutenant general, a political commissar, he demonstrated the fact that the Muscovite leadership always understood the Babi Yar crime and that they laid on German troops to be only a war propaganda fairy tale. The reality confirms the Pravda report mentioned on page 17 of issue number 51, wherein Nikita Khrushchev, as a head of the government of the USSR from 1957 to 64, condemned the Babi Yar monument in Kiev for its reference to Jews. So let's look here. Let's see. After Joseph Stalin's death, Nikita Sergeyev Khrushchev launched his de-Stalinization campaign with a secret speech to the 20th Party Congress. His denunciation of Stalin's abuses of power, deportation of ethnic minorities, and mass terror led to the release of thousands of political prisoners. In 1962, during a short-lived liberalization, Solzhenitsyn was allowed to publish One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, the searing tale of man's struggle to survive a winter's day imprisonment in the Gulag archipelago. Incidentally, it was into, this is case 5, incidentally, it was into the Ukraine after it was conquered back by the Red Army in 1943 that a most powerful reverse flow of refugees occurred, a remark obviously referring to Jews because the returning bosses and owners of enviable dwellings were received in the most unfriendly manner by the population. Even the likewise returning Nikita Khrushchev seems to have favored this tendency by accusing Jews of committing not a few sins in the past toward the Ukrainian people, unquote, and pointing them instead towards Azerbaijan in the Far East. Of his own sins against the Ukrainian people during the Soviet retreat of June-July 1941, when he ordered the liquidation of all political prisoners, Khrushchev certainly did not speak. Solzhenitsyn, too, was silent about this, at least over the extent of these crimes. Solzhenitsyn does mention, however, another flow of Jewish refugees, those who, after approximately 454,000 Volga Germans were driven out of their lands beginning in August 1941, pushed into the, quote, freed up and desirable living areas, so much so that the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee submitted a request to Moscow for the transfer of the former Republic of the Volga Germans to the Jews. This petition makes it clear that the Jewish settlements already there were by no means few in size or number. In addition, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee strongly petitioned to get the northern Crimea for the Jews after Stalin had expelled the Crimean Tatars in order to acquire their freed up and desirable living areas also. Solzhenitsyn adds, these Jewish requests for Crimea were used soon thereafter as proof of a, quote, plan for high treason by the members of the JAFC. We are not aware of any Jewish survivor statistics where all these returnees are also counted. Case 6. The total number of Jewish soldiers in the Red Army is designated in Jewish publications as 500,000 to 550,000. There must be added to them possibly another 25,000 to 30,000 Jewish partisans who were called up only later into the Red Army. With a total of 19.65 million wartime draftees into the Red Army, 1941 through 45, the Jewish percentage at approximately 2.6 to 2.7, even given any possible uncertainty over the numbers in use, exceeds substantially the Jewish percentage of the total Soviet population of 1.8%. The Russian western areas and the Polish eastern areas that have been heavily settled by Jews, in view of the claimed total extermination policy during National Socialistic rule with its millions of Jewish victims, this statistic about the Jewish percentage of draftees raises serious questions, or more precisely, it disproves these claims. It must also be kept in mind that Solzhenitsyn has made use exclusively of Jewish sources in the central archives of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Case 7. Mikhail Scheinemann, a regional secretary since the 1920s of the Komsomol, the Soviet youth organization, afterward prominently involved in the Federation of the Militant Godless, a graduate of the Institute of Red Professorship and a co-worker in the press and printing section of the CC of the CPSU, fell into German hands in 1941 and, quote, survives as a Jew and a high communist political functionary in a camp throughout the whole war in Germany, unquote. How does this agree with the, quote, policy of total extermination, unquote? Solzhenitsyn merely acts surprised at this, and also over the fact that, unlike almost all other released mujiks, in 1946 he lands a job in the Museum of Religious History and then in the Institute of History of the Academy of Sciences. This sums up all that Solzhenitsyn had to report about official Soviet reaction to the, quote, total destruction policy of the National Socialists towards the Jews, unquote, of Russia. That and the clear statement that, quote, the Soviet mass media played down information about the atrocities committed by the German occupation against the Jews, unquote. He did not indicate any reasons for this mass media policy. Aside from mentioning Soviet announcements, he does not examine anything related to what he designates as the total destruction of the Jews by the National Socialists. This corresponds accurately with what the New York-born historian Joseph Bellinger described in 1949, quote, in addition, there were substantial problems connected with furnishing unimpeachable legal evidence as to the acts charged against armed forces of the Axis. The pitiful results that relevant investigations had produced were already giving stomach pains to the Western Allies in 1945. Telford Taylor reports, our main problem was that we did not have very many proofs of war crimes on hand and were dependents on the Soviet Union for furnishing such proofs. The British Minister of Foreign Affairs, Anthony Eden, rejected, however, Soviet suggestions that instead of proofs, there should be show trials with subsequent executions of the accused. The only entity still raising this idea was the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Its leader, Henry Ehrlich, was released from prison in 1941. Solzhenitsyn clarifies, but in December 1941, the leader of the committee, who had taken too many liberties, were arrested. Ehrlich hanged himself in prison. However, in the spring of 1942, a Jewish anti-fascist committee was drummed up anew. The highlighted quote, our main problem was that we did not have very many proofs of war crimes against the Germans on hand and were dependent on the Soviets for furnishing such proofs. This time exclusively, Soviet Jews sat on it under the guidance of Chekist Shanky Epstein at the helm. Solzhenitsyn makes no mention of the promotional tour, and the two representatives of the group, Solomon Michols and Itzik Pfeffer, made in the U.S. in June and July 1943. They showed a piece of soap, quote, the Nazis manufactured from Jewish flesh, unquote, and told more stories of the same kind. They were able to collect from gullible donors more than 2 million with their stories to be used for the Soviet Jewish combat troops. Staliger Report. Solzhenitsyn here introduces the report by SS Startenführer Colonel Dr. Walter Staliger of October 15, 1941, in such as way as to conclude from it that, as Solzhenitsyn paraphrases, quote, the German plan consisted of creating the impression that it was not the Germans but the local population that began the extermination of the Jews, unquote. However, here again, Solzhenitsyn did not examine the report, but simply takes it uncritically from the protocols of the Allied Military Tribunal in Nuremberg of 1945 through 46, and from Jewish authors who, for their part, refer back to it and likewise promote it unchecked for authenticity. The entire problem and the methodology of the Allied reification policy with its mendacious claims, extorted confessions, and falsified documents was obviously an unknown area to him. In any case, he has not concerned himself with it and did not consult in any critical literature while doing his scientific research. The reader is invited to consider the relevant investigations of an alleged letter written by General Reinhard Heydrich on July 2, 1941, This in connection with the so-called Dr. Stoliker report, in order to determine for himself that the Allies, in their protocol volume 37, page 670, introduced a document into which several pages were, quote, smuggled that corresponded to the version they desired the world to read of what happened. Here we have a picture of the Soviet brutality in Estonia. During the Soviet occupation of 1940 through 41, 179 people were sentenced to death in Estonia by Soviet courts, and about 2,200 were killed in other ways. Most were killed by the security police in the prisons in Tartu and Cursory. To hide their crimes, the communists in Tartu hid 190 bodies in a well in a police station yard. Some victims shown at left. During the Soviet era, all discussions of communist killings was prohibited. But in 1988, a newspaper in Sarima was able to publish an eyewitness account of the Tartu massacre. Quote, as far as I know, only 3 persons were shot to death and later found in the well. All the others were tortured to death. They numbered about 100. Nobody knows the exact number. The methods of torture were numerous. One man had his lips cut off, another his nose, tongue, and ears. Many had their feet boiled. There were also victims from whose backs pieces of skin were cut out and who had their hands bound behind their backs with barbed wire. A few had their eyes cut out. I was there when the bodies were removed from the cellars. During the day, thousands of people came to look for their loved ones. Many found them. It was a horrible sight, one I will never forget. Hitler's further plans. As previously stressed, it is unfortunate that Solzhenitsyn based his entire Chapter 9 concerning the war between the Soviet Union and Germany exclusively on Jewish sources. An excerpt from minutes of the IMT and a few Soviet and/or Russian publications, which he put together or copied there without having independently examined even a single case. Therefore, it is pointless to deal with his representations in this chapter at all. Because what is one to think when wrong statements are served up to the reader as from a production line while simultaneously important basic facts are omitted? Why, for example, does he maintain that the Einsatzgruppen were under the command of Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Central Security Office, and was entrusted with the solution of the Jewish question, even though in reality they were subordinate to the army commanders? They decided on their actions only in conference with the latter, taking into consideration the immediate security needs of the German troops in each area in view of the ever-dangerous partisan assaults that often had nothing to do with Jews, but instead with guerrilla bands that were often merely led by Jews and inserted by a parachute behind the lines. Or how can he not say a word about the Jewish declaration of a war against Germany as early as March 24th, 1933, a holy war introduced by a far-reaching economic boycott against Germany, quote, to the point of its destruction, unquote, nor bring up the later declaration of war by the Jewish World Congress of August 25th, 1939, before the actual beginning of the war with Poland. Or why not mention, if Adolf Hitler is to be proclaimed guilty, and he alone, for the outbreak of World War II, generally, and of the German-Soviet War in particular, Joseph Stalin's world revolutionary objectives, his attack strategy, his years-long preparation, and his gigantic military deployment along his western border districts in June of 1941. And why not add at least a few words about his bestial methods, totally at odds with the rules of war from the very first day? Or why completely hush up the top Bolshevik priority of massacring the elite of other nations, as in the case of the German-Soviet War, and in addition, the Soviets' mass murder of over 15,000 Polish officers and others in the forest near Katyn? Although such criminal goings-on were well known by even the Soviet population itself and its officer corps through the 20-year-old history of the Cheka, the GPU, and the NKVD. After the deportation of the Germans, there occurred a second wave of deportations from November 1943 to June 1944. 6 groups of ethnics were deported under the pretext that large numbers had collaborated with the German occupation government to Siberia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. These were the Chechens, Ingushes, Crimean Tatars, Karachians, Balkayans, and Kalmuks. After this first wave of deportations, during which about 900,000 humans were displaced, there followed July to December 1944 similar operations with the goal of cleansing the Crimea and the Caucasus of other doubtful nationalities. Such a concept was totally foreign to the Germans. However, Stalin had planned this for all the German officers and police, as Adolf Hitler was well aware before the Russian campaign began, which impelled him to issue his Commissar order, which in view of the above facts required the political commissars of the Red Army, mostly Jewish, to be shot out of hand as war criminals. Solzhenitsyn must have been aware of this and of Soviet military practices that started on the first day of the war in June 1941, quote, spontaneously and along the whole line of the front, unquote, as well as further extermination orders issued by Moscow on July 3, 1941, stating that not only captured German officers, but all captured German soldiers who fell into their hands were to be killed either immediately or after a short interrogation. Although Germany was a signatory to the Geneva Protocols, which provided for humane treatment of captured soldiers, the USSR was not. Let's look at this highlight here. How can Solzhenitsyn not say a word about the Jewish declaration of war against Germany, a far-reaching economic boycott meant to completely destroy Germany? Why was Solzhenitsyn silent about this, and likewise about Katyn, although precisely in this latter case because of its monstrous malevolence its order of magnitude, the international attention it garnered, and its NKVD execution personnel were integral to his topic. In addition to Stalin, Voroshilov, Mikoyan, Kalinin, Kaganovich, and others had signed the minutes of the Politburo meeting number 13 of March 5, 1941, containing the order to shoot all 15,000 surrendered Polish officers, as well as a further 11,000 prominent Polish civilians. In peacetime with Poland in February 1940, Stalin handed down his little slip of paper, liquidate. Many of the accomplices have remained anonymous, but quite a few have been identified. Beria as head of the NKVD, and W.N. Merkulov as General and People's Commissar for Internal Security, the NKVD generals Reichman, Zhukov, and Saburin, P.K. Sopunenko, and P.K. Selioni, Comrade Buryanov, who was assigned by the Moscow NKVD main office to supervise executions, and Partikov, the administrative leader of the NKVD in Minsk. These members of the NKVD command in Minsk were also implicated: Levi Rybak, Chaim Feinberg, Abraham Bomsovich, Boris Kutsov, Ivan Saikhanov, Paul Borodinsky, and Osab Lisik, among others. Furthermore, the officers Joshua Sorokin, a major, Alexander Suslov, and Simeon Tikhonov, both second lieutenants in 1940, who later in Israel confessed their complicity. There are Stalin's purges of his officers' corps between May 1937 and 1941, in which over 35,000 of high rank and even the highest ranks, generals and admirals, were victims of arrest, dismissal, or liquidation. His other millionfold political mass murders and his demand, issued at the Tehran Conference in November 1943 with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, that 50,000 German officers be shot, confirmed that this mentality and these intentions were directed towards Germany as well. This, too, Solzhenitsyn does not mention. We find the thousand-fold prison murders committed by the NKVD as it withdrew eastward in July 1941, the Soviet instructions in 1941 to immediately shoot all German prisoners of war, and the bestial communist conduct of partisan warfare in total violation of the rules of war. All of this is totally concealed and replaced in his history of the German-Soviet War with unproven statements about, quote, systematic destruction of Jews by German troops, unquote. Solzhenitsyn wheeled out the term German gas vans without, however, presenting the slightest proof of their existence. This unproven statement makes it abundantly clear just tainted he is by Germanophobia. Let's go back up here. Solzhenitsyn dead at 89, the late great Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, a passionately committed anti-communist writer and a voice for freedom, was a vital source of spiritual nourishment to a huge circle of readers. Born December 11, 1918, he died on August 3, 2008, at the age of 89. Solzhenitsyn felt it was his duty to record Russia's shocking Gulag experiences for mankind to ponder. He was well aware that such could well be America's own experiences eventually, should we fail to find leaders of the same moral caliber as our founding fathers. Despite a Soviet ban imposed on all his works after the publication of his 1962 A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, he was widely read in Russia and was also the only Russian writer to hit the bestseller lists in the Western world. In his acceptance of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, Solzhenitsyn quoted a Russian proverb that accurately summarizes his creed, quote, "One word of truth shall outweigh the whole world," unquote. After being expelled from Russia, where he had survived nearly 10 years in the Gulag archipelago, he migrated to America to shut himself away behind barbed wire-topped walls in a Vermont mountain town to maintain his working regimen. If he despised the heavy-handed Soviet communist rule, he also came to loathe the West's smug hedonism almost equally. This view did not endear him to America's controlled media, which lost no time in portraying him as bigoted and anti-social. In the Black Book of Communism, we read, between July and December 1941, 210 penal colonies, 135 prisons, and 27 camps were shifted eastward. That is approximately 750,000 prisoners altogether. Most prisoners were evacuated on foot over distances of often more than 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles. When no time remained to evacuate the camps, which occurred frequently in the first weeks of the war, the prisoners were summarily lined up against the wall and shot. This happened particularly in the western Ukraine, where the NKVD massacred 10,000 prisoners in Lvov at the end of June of 1941, 1,200 prisoners in the prison of Lutsk, 1,500 in Stanislavov, 500 in Dubno, etc. In the regions of Lvov, Zhytomyr, and Vinnytsia, the Germans, upon their arrival, discovered dozens of mass graves. Or why does he pass over without any comment the collective deportations, together with the expropriations and other brutalities, of 446 Volga Germans and other 448,120 Russian Germans in August-September 1941, with an average of 2,000 humans packed into each freight train for a 4 to 8 week trip, hauled away into the southern Siberian regions of Omsk, Novosibirsk, and Bernal, or into Krasnoyarsk in Siberia and Kazakhstan, with a death toll of 20% and more. To carry out these crimes against humanity immediately after the outbreak of Germany's Russian campaign, Beria had imported the Deputy People's Commissar of the Interior, General Ivan Serov, into the Autonomous Republic of the Volga Germans, along with 14,000 NKVD troops, some in German uniform, to deceive and provoke the people there. He might also have mentioned that 450,000 out of the 600,000 Jews forcibly kidnapped from Poland into the Soviet, not the German, sphere of influence disappeared without a trace. The Black Book of Communism adds, if one takes into account the further deportations of Germans carried out in 1942, one comes up with a total figure for all ethnic groups of 1,209,430 people deported within 1 year, from August 1941 until June 1942. If Solzhenitsyn, without proof, states that Germans had farmers shot as partisans if they did not deliver their quotas and burned their farms down, those were certainly Soviet methods, not German. Or why speak of a mass liquidation of 33,771 Jews carried out in Babi Yar near Kiev in September 1941 as a well-known, quote, fact, quote, only to boost that figure to 100,000 murdered by the Germans there, quote, simply because one may assume it, as Solzhenitsyn has stated before. If Solzhenitsyn had carefully researched all of this and placed it in the context of the conflict with Germany, he could have opened up a broad new field of historical interconnections, and thereby, in accordance with his own words, he could have counteracted the stupidification of the natives in Central Europe, but he did not, and here he too remains a prisoner of Soviet Allied wartime propaganda. Harsh trials in post-war years. In the post-war period, Soviet Jews faced not only figuratively harsh trials, but starting from 1948, renewed purges and the smashing of many of their positions of power. Stalin kept liberating the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee from its leading figures by shooting them. State attacks against those code-worded as cosmopolitans in the sciences, arts, and the Soviet press led to analogous fates. The JAFC, according to the Kremlin's view, had pursued Zionist goals too independently and had lost sight of, quote, the determined fight against international reaction, unquote. Here Solzhenitsyn is quoted in depth from his massive tome, The Jews in the Soviet Empire, in the Soviet Union, rather. As things proceeded, the fate of the JAFC was gradually also decided. At the end of 1948, its offices were sealed, its documents sent to KGB headquarters, the Lubyanka prison, and the newspaper and publishing house were closed. Subsequently, the two key figures in the JAFC, I.S. Pfeiffer and W.I. Susskind, were secretly arrested. They remained in Lubyanka for over 3 years. Further arrests followed. 13 men from the JAFC were condemned to death in 1952 and then shot. The full annihilation of the JAFC was accompanied by equally secret subordinate trials. 110 people were arrested, 10 of them shot, and 5 died during the investigation. In the autumn of 1952, Stalin proceeded more openly. A wave of arrests among Jews began. Even the veteran murderer inciter against the German civilian population, whose pro-rape slogan was "Break the racial pride of the Germanic woman," Ilya Ehrenberg, was stripped of his power. The original galley proofs of his own Black Book, which dealt with the suffering and destruction of the Soviet Jews during the war between the USSR and Germany, produced by Ehrenberg and Vasily Grossman, were pulped. This fact is particularly interesting for historical researchers because Grossman, with his scientific appearing official party propaganda works such as The Hell of Treblinka, his pieces on Majdanek, Babi Yar, Auschwitz, and similar works, had until then been largely touted as a respectable researcher. From the pulping in the year 1948 of his effusions, one may conclude that the Soviet authorities themselves never believed the word of it. In December 1952 in Prague, Czechoslovakia, Rudolf Slansky, the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, the CPCS, along with 10 collaborators from that city and from the Communist Party, were executed. 8 of the 11 were Jews. Solzhenitsyn says, the trial had an openly anti-Jewish character, including the naming in court of Jews such as the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, and FDR's Treasury Secretary 1933-45, Henry Morgenthau, as world leaders, with the American leaders Truman and Acheson decried as being under their control. Summing up the sentiment de rigueur, Czech communist leader Klement Gottwald said, quote, during the investigation phase of the trial, a new channel was uncovered through which betrayal and espionage seeped into the Communist Party. This channel is Zionism. To mask Stalin's main anti-Jewish thrust, several Russian nationalist opposition figures also came under the persecutory pressure. Thus, in the Leningrad trials of the early 1950s, about 200 party workers were arrested and later shot. After that, Stalin started with vast diversionary maneuvers to the displacement of Jews from Soviet culture. The famous, quote, campaign against the cosmopolitans focused exclusively on Jews. Even the faithful old communist history falsifier, member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences and holder of the Lenin Prize, Isaac Israelovich Mins, was stripped of all his honors. The majority of the victims in the 1951 series of dismissals of directors and chief engineers in the airplane, metal, and armaments industries were also Jews. In the Red Army, the Soviet leadership did not limit itself to pursuing Jewish generals. Officers of lower rank involved in the development of weapons and military equipment were likewise removed. Then the purges spread through the defense industry to aviation, the automobile industry, without, however, touching the atomic industry, and they went on into the primarily administrative posts. Shortly before his death in 1953, Stalin had reputable Kremlin physicians arrested. He had already begun with his doctor's plot move in 1951, but then countrywide as well, he commenced putting various Jewish doctors behind bars, and under the same motto as in 1937, certain physicians treat national leaders in a criminal fashion. The investigations were accompanied by grave abuse of the accused and by the wildest reproaches, developed ever more along the lines of espionage, terroristic conspiracies with contacts to foreign intelligence services, and plots involving, quote, American mercenaries, diversionists in white smocks, and bourgeois nationalists. And the persecutions were directed primarily against Jews. After the death of the Soviet dictator on March 6, 1953, every one of these procedures was stopped, and the accused doctors were all rehabilitated. Finally, in his book, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn deplores the lack of repentance. The ideology and quasi-religious state cult called the Shoah, or Holocaust, cannot divert, he writes, from, quote, their own responsibility for their participation in the shootings by the Cheka, the barges sunk with the doomed into the White and Caspian Seas, their own participation in the horrors of farm collectivization, the starvation in Ukraine, the active co-responsibility in all the disgraces of Soviet rule, and a talented zeal in the deliberate dumbing down of the natives. All these activities show the exact opposite of repentance. But we must share responsibility for those events, no matter whether we see the victims as brothers or as strangers. Repentance, mutual regret for truly everything that happened, would be the cleanest and most purifying path. And here, dear friends, we come to the end. We could share this. The Lubyanka prison in Moscow, from the beginning of Cheka GPU rule in 1918 on, in its cellars, prisoners were systematically shot in the back of the head. The Cheka and GPU were judge, jury, and executioner with their own absolute powers. At the peak of the arrests in the mid-1930s, paranoia reigned in the cities. Intellectuals slept with suitcases of clothes and supplies under their beds. Arrests usually came at night when there would be few witnesses. Private conversations were scrutinized as much as published work for any possible incriminating comment. In the later years, jokes that satirized the Soviet state were rated according to how many years one can get for repeating them. Opportunists took advantage of this frenzy to rid themselves of opponents or of those standing in their way. Above, the Lubyanka prison as it appeared in 2003, and to the right, the Lubyanka prison in the 1920s, followed by letters to the editor. So yes, again, thank you for joining us for these two videos as we read Udo Walensky's book review of Solzhenitsyn's The Jews and Soviet Union, which is volume 2 of his 200 Years Together, a black listed book that has yet to appear in the English language because how it is clearly incriminating with the suggestion and claim of vast Zionist and Jewish involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution, which ultimately led to the death of 66 million human lives, which is Solzhenitsyn's final tally from all of his historical research. And we present this to people not to demonize a group, not to encourage hate, not to incite any kind of violent activity, but specifically to prevent future Holocaust, to prevent future genocide of anybody, of any religion, of any people group, of any race. I pray, as this information goes forward, that the Creator would bless it to the awakening of the masses, and that people would take to their hearts the teaching of Jesus Christ when he said to love one another and to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and that we as a planetary species can overcome all competition, war, racial pride, discrimination, prejudice, as we look upon each other as children of the Father, pure love, upon this, our Mother Earth, that we might live together and coexist peacefully, helping one another and helping our planet to recover from all of the abuses of industry upon it, that would overcome our species' tendency towards greed and selfishness and fighting over resources, and especially to overcome any kind of thinking or teaching that would allow us to view another human being as something less than a divine creation. I pray that Creator would bless us all and bring us back into a collective awareness of our divine origins and our divine destiny, that truth would prevail in all things in this age of information, that intelligent people would band together, organize and strategize to prevent any movements designed to destroy or to hurt any segment of the human population. And that we recognize that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of wickedness in high places, against principalities and powers, and that we might put on the full armor of God, the sword of the Spirit, the shield of faith, really ultimately the proclamation of truth. May all beings be released from suffering. May all beings love and be loved. May all beings be blessed and bless one another. We thank you again for this time together and look forward to sharing more truthful information with you in the future. Once again, our reading has come from the Barnes Review, a Journal of Nationalist Thought and History, Volume 14, Number 5, September-October 2008, Russia and the Jews. First time ever reviewed in the English language, the great Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's banned book on the Russian-Jewish relations and the Christian Holocaust. My name is David Bryson. Thank you for spending this time with me. God bless you. God bless us all.